The bitter Alaskan wind was a familiar companion, a constant reminder that nature cared little for human comfort. Tonight, however, it carried a different kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures clinging to the glass of the police cruiser. Emily sat inside, bathed in the flashing red and blue of emergency lights, her hands clasped neatly in her lap, a serene smile playing on her lips, a perfect picture of innocence, except for the cold, dead light in her eyes that mirrored the void in the crawl space beneath the house. My stomach knotted, a familiar vice tightening around my gut. The articles, the quiet house, the cloying smell, it all clicked into place with a sickening finality. She wasn't the victim, not really. She was the architect. It started, as it always did, with something mundane, a leaky faucet, a late-night call. Another broken piece of the world I felt obligated to try and fix, even when every fiber of my being screamed for me to stay put, to just let the damn thing drip. I've been managing properties for over a decade, mostly the isolated ones, the ones clinging to the wild edges of Alaska. And I developed a sixth sense for trouble. It usually announced itself with a missing rent payment or the sudden, telltale silence of a tenant who'd skipped town. So when Emily Rivers moved in, she felt like an anomaly. Too good to be true, which, in my experience, usually meant she'd materialized in my life like a ghost, polite and almost unnervingly quiet. Her rent check arrived like clockwork, always early, every single month. She kept to herself, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking for new friends, especially not after everything. The less interaction, the better. She worked for some tech company she'd mentioned with odd hours, which explained her occasional absence. She'd chosen the rental specifically for its privacy, she said, its location on the very fringe of town, swallowed by the encroaching woods, a prime spot for someone who wanted to disappear, or for someone who wanted to make someone disappear. My cynicism, well honed over years of dealing with the quirks and cruelties of humanity, immediately filed her under suspiciously perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. Not in this life. Not for me. Her husband, if he existed, was a phantom. Emily handled everything, every email, every question, every payment. It was like he was a convenient fiction, a placeholder in her life that never quite solidified into a real person. I never pushed it. My job wasn't to pry into the marital arrangements of my tenants, just to ensure the plumbing worked and the checks cleared. I just logged it away. Another small, unsettling detail in the otherwise unblemished facade of Emily Rivers. A few weeks ago, my old flip phone buzzed on the dashboard of my truck. Emily, a text, not a call. It was late, pushing 10, the kind of hour when most folks were winding down, not dealing with domestic emergencies. Leaky faucet, the text read, stark against the glowing screen. It's urgent. The dripping is driving me crazy. She'd added a string of polite, desperate emojis, practically begging. My first thought was to brush her off until morning. Plumbing emergencies rarely warranted a late-night call unless water was actively flooding the living room. But then that damned, regrettable flicker of responsibility, the Achilles heel I'd never quite managed to cauterize, flared up. Fine, I muttered to myself, rubbing the stubble on my chin. Another late-night drive to nowhere. I grabbed my ancient toolkit, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and pulled on my jacket. It was an old, battered thing, but it was mine. A second skin that had seen more horrors than I cared to count. A small comfort against the vast indifference of the Alaskan night. I glanced at my analog wristwatch, more out of habit than need. 10:17 p.m. The hands seemed to crawl. The drive to her place was short, but the silence of the forest road felt heavy, pressing in on the truck. The pines stood like dark, watchful sentinels, their branches thick with shadows that seemed to shift just at the periphery of my vision. By the time I pulled into her gravel driveway, the air was still and cold. a premonition in the frigid bite. Emily's car wasn't there. Confirming her odd hours claim, I pulled the spare key from my ring, the cold metal digging into my palm, and let myself in. "Emily," I called out, my voice swallowed by the unnatural quiet of the house. No answer, just the hollow echo of my own inquiry. The house was wrong, spotless, yes, but not just clean. It was sterile, a display home, not a lived-in space. No muddy boots by the door, no half-read book on a coffee table, no overflowing mail slot, not even a single misplaced crumb on the pristine countertops. It was as if someone had meticulously bleached away every trace of human habitation, every imperfection, every speck of dust that might hint at a life lived within its walls. The air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean of scent, almost metallic. I could practically hear the hum of the refrigerator in the silence. It put me on edge immediately. I wanted to get the job done and get out. My instincts, usually a reliable barometer for impending doom, were screaming. This was too neat, too perfect. Something was profoundly, fundamentally off. I found the source of the problem in the kitchen, just as she'd said. The faucet dripped with maddening regularity, a tiny, insistent drumbeat in the oppressive silence. It wasn't anything major, just a loose valve, probably jarred by a pipe shift or age. As I tightened it with a practiced hand, my fingers brushed against the chrome of the garbage disposal, and a faint, cloying smell wafted up, metallic, sour, horrific, like a butcher shop on a hot day, but worse, with an underlying sweetness that spoke of decay. It wasn't the usual kitchen stink of old food scraps. This was something else entirely, something organic and wrong. My observational skills, honed by years of seeing things I shouldn't, took over. My gaze lingered on the drain, a dark maw in the gleaming sink. The stench was pulling at me, an unwelcome curiosity. Against my better judgment, and Lord knows I have a long history of ignoring better judgment, I grabbed the heavy-duty mag light from my toolkit. The beam cut a sharp path through the dim kitchen, illuminating the glistening maw of the disposal. I peered down, holding my breath, the sour metallic scent stinging my nostrils. At first, I couldn't make sense of the dark mass clinging to the blades, just a wet, indistinct blob. But then the light shifted, catching a stray strand, and my gut lurched. Hair, long, dark, matted hair, thick and tangled, a horrifying nest clogging the disposal. It wasn't just a few strands from a shower drain. This was a mass, a lot of it, too much. My stomach coiled, and I instinctively pulled back, gagging, a wave of nausea washing over me. "None of my business," I muttered aloud, the words tasting like ash. Absolutely none of my damn business. Maybe she tried to wash out a wig, I told myself, clutching at the flimsy straw of normalcy, or a shedding pet. Though the house showed no signs of a pet. People do weird things, right? Especially when they live out here, isolated. My mind raced, searching for any logical explanation, anything to calm the rising tide of dread. But the smell, oh God, the smell. It clung to me, seeping into my clothes, permeating the very air I breathed. It was the smell of something not quite dead, or maybe something recently made dead. That night, sleep was a cruel joke. The cloying scent, even after I'd scrubbed my hands raw, seemed to stick to my skin, lingering in my nostrils. The image of that matted hair, a wet, dark tangle in the drain, replayed itself on the inside of my eyelids. I tossed and turned, the worn leather jacket I draped over the chair, a silent, reassuring weight in the darkness, yet offering no real comfort. My old analog watch, abandoned on the nightstand, seemed to tick louder than usual, counting down to whatever fresh hell awaited me. Then, the nightmare came, greeting me with open, skeletal arms. It was vivid, grotesque, and utterly relentless. I was back in that sterile kitchen, the dripping faucet a rhythmic pulse in the silence. The disposal, a hungry maw, began to churn, but instead of hair, something else was emerging. Slowly, viciously, a mangled, skeletal figure, like a broken puppet but with bones and muscles tied on, visible under pale, translucent skin that draped over it like a wet bedsheet. Its limbs were elongated, disproportionate, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It oozed from the drain, wet and slick, its form shimmering in the dim light. I could hear the faint, sickening slurp as it pulled itself free, each movement accompanied by the creak of unseen joints. It was pure, distilled horror, the kind that burrowed deep into your subconscious and set up permanent residence. Just as its head snapped towards me, its empty eye sockets fixing me with an ancient, malevolent gaze, the shrill, jarring shriek of my alarm clock tore through the darkness. 7 a.m. A blessed, albeit violent, reprieve. I lay there for a long moment, heart hammering against my ribs, the lingering scent of decay in my memory, the phantom touch of cold fear on my skin. That dream, a grotesque harbinger, was something I wouldn't forget for a very, very long time. It was a stark reminder of the things that festered just beneath the surface of the mundane world, and how easily they could claw their way out. The next day, Emily texted, a bland, "Thank you for fixing the faucet." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to ask about the hair, about the smell, about the unsettling emptiness of her house. But that cynical part of me, the part that had learned to stay out of trouble by minding its own business, held me back. It wasn't my place. That nightmare, I reasoned, was just the price of my own morbid curiosity. "Don't go looking for answers, Leo," it whispered. "You won't like what you find." I closed the message, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air between us, a silent barrier I chose not to cross. But the seed had been planted. The image of the hair, the smell, the sterile house, they burrowed into my mind like parasites, refusing to let go. That night, instead of my usual routine of poring over truck routes or sorting through receipts in the dimly lit motel room, I pulled up Emily's rental application on my ancient laptop. Everything was by the book: steady job, good credit, no criminal record, flawless, too flawless. A gut feeling, that insidious, persistent intuition that had saved my skin more times than I cared to admit, gnawed at me. Something was off. It always was. I closed the application and opened a new browser tab. Emily Rivers, I typed, the words feeling heavy. A transgression? My first search brought up her social media profiles. Sparse, mostly work-related posts, a few generic vacation photos. Nothing to explain the unsettling feeling she gave me. No red flags. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, followed by a familiar surge of self-recrimination. "See, Leo? Just a normal person. You're just paranoid." But the paranoia was a friend, a grim, unwelcome companion that had kept me alive. I widened my search, adding keywords: news, arrest, incident. My finger hovered over the trackpad, a nervous tick. And then, there it was. An article from 6 years ago. The headline, stark and uncompromising, burned itself into my retina. Emily Rivers, local woman involved in brutal home invasion. My breath hitched. The details that followed were a cold shower of dread. She'd been attacked in her apartment late at night by a man. She'd fought him off. He'd escaped before the police arrived. The article mentioned he'd been caught later, imprisoned on breaking and entering charges. And then, a detail that made the blood drain from my face. Released last month. A chill, colder than any Alaskan winter, ran down my spine. This explained everything. Her privacy, her choice of the isolated house, her desperate need for a new deadbolt. She was terrified. She was running, just like me, but from a tangible threat. A man, not a spectral abomination from another dimension, not the whispering dead, but a flesh and blood monster. It almost felt quaint. My shoulders relaxed, a fraction of the tension easing. This was a normal kind of horror, a human one. A few days later, my phone rang. Not a text this time, a call. My heart immediately went into overdrive. No good news ever comes via phone call in my line of work, especially not from a tenant who normally communicates via terse text messages. It was Emily. Her voice was thin, strained, laced with a barely suppressed hysteria. "I think someone's been in my house," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other. While I was at work, I can't explain it. Things just feel off. She sounded genuinely panicked, her composed facade finally cracking. The cynical part of me wanted to say, "Welcome to the club." The reluctant conscience, however, was already grabbing the keys. "I'm on my way," I said, the words a familiar, grim resignation. When I arrived, she was pacing the driveway, a pale wraith in the gathering dusk, her shoulders hunched against an invisible weight. Her eyes, usually so composed, darted nervously around the perimeter of the house like a cornered animal. She launched into a breathless explanation. "It's just little things. The couch pillows, they were arranged differently. My toothbrush, it was angled wrong in the holder. Nothing's missing. Nothing's broken. But I know." Her voice rose on the last word, conviction warring with terror. I scanned the property, the woods pressed in, dark and silent, offering a million places for someone to hide, to watch. I checked the locks, one by one. The front door, the back door, all the windows. Each one secure, latched tight, no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place, no muddy footprints, no scuff marks on the sills. The only thing out of place was Emily herself, her agitated presence disrupting the otherwise pristine order of the driveway. I told her it was probably her imagination, the lingering trauma of her past attack playing tricks on her mind. I offered the standard landlord platitudes, empty reassurances that tasted like ash in my mouth. She nodded, but her eyes held a desperate, unconvinced flicker. Before I left, she asked if I'd install a second deadbolt on the front door. "Absolutely," I said, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "First thing tomorrow." A part of me wanted to tell her to just get out, to cut her losses and disappear. But then, where would she go? I knew the feeling. There was nowhere to run. That was 2 nights ago. This morning, I was halfway through my lukewarm coffee, contemplating the dreary prospect of installing a new deadbolt, when my phone rang again. This time, it was the police. My stomach dropped. "There's been an incident at the property on Aspen Lane," the officer's voice said, crisp and unfeeling. "We need the landlord to come down." The drive there was a blur. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. The police cars were already there, their lights strobing through the pre-dawn gloom, painting the quiet residential street in violent reds and blues. Officers swarmed the house, a hive of activity. Yellow crime scene tape, a garish ribbon against the gray wood. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Not again, I thought. A desperate, futile prayer. Please, not again. One of them, a burly cop with a tired face, peeled away from the cordon and walked towards me. "You the landlord?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, my throat dry, every muscle in my body tensing. He didn't waste words. "We found a body," he said, his gaze unwavering. "In the crawl space under the house." The world tilted. My mind reeled, trying to process the information, to fit it into the neat, terrible narrative I'd constructed. "A body?" I managed, my voice a croak. "Who?" He hesitated, a fleeting flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. A man. We're still identifying him, but it looks like he's been there a while. A while, the words echoed in the chill air, taking on a sinister weight. How long exactly was a while? My mind raced, flashing back to Emily's spotless house, the almost clinical cleanliness, her unsettling composure, her sudden, manufactured panic, the desperate request for a second deadbolt, the hair in the drain, the smell, my nightmare. Oh God, the nightmare. The mangled figure slowly pulling itself from the drain, its skin like a wet bedsheet. Was that what it had been? A premonition? Or a memory from her past? A glimpse into her grim process? The pieces of a puzzle, long scattered, were starting to click into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than anything I'd imagined. And then I saw her, Emily, sitting in the back of a police cruiser, a dark silhouette against the flashing lights. She looked calm, too calm. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her head tilted slightly, almost artfully, as if she were listening to some far-off, unheard melody. No tears, no shock, no fear, just that serene, unsettling stillness. The kind of stillness you find in a predator, waiting. My feet moved on their own, drawing me closer, a moth to a deadly flame. As I approached, she turned her head slowly, deliberately, and looked at me. Her expression didn't change. Not a muscle twitched, but her eyes, those dark, unblinking eyes, they pierced right through me, cold and ancient, devoid of all human warmth, like chips of obsidian. The same eyes from my nightmare, unblinking, unfeeling. And then, with a jolt that felt like a physical blow, I remembered the article, not just the headline, not the superficial details I'd skimmed, but the photo, the one I'd dismissed as a generic stock image. Emily, 6 years ago, sitting on the front steps of her old apartment building, her face pale and tear-streaked, and behind her, barely visible, officers were wheeling out a stretcher with a man on it. I'd assumed, in my haste, in my comfortable, self-serving narrative, that he was the intruder, the attacker, the monster, the one who had terrorized her. But the article hadn't said that. I had superimposed my own interpretation onto it, a convenient filter to make sense of the chaos. I had been too tired, too ready to categorize her as a victim, to truly read out. Looking back now, the headline itself, if I stripped away my own preconceived notions, sounded off, a chillingly polite deception. My gaze locked with hers through the glass of the cruiser. She didn't look away. Her lips parted, just slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible curve, like she was about to speak, but she didn't have to. The words of the original article, now reread in my mind's eye, echoed with a new, horrifying clarity. A 19-year-old man was found in a crawl space inside of his own home after a supposed home invasion. Emily Rivers, a local dentist, was arrested on suspicion of murder and arrested for breaking and entering. Breaking and entering, not as a victim, as the perpetrator. The pieces slammed together, forming a horrifying mosaic. The immaculate house, the absent husband, the hair in the drain, the sickly sweet smell of decay, the fabricated fear, the second deadbolt, a final chilling touch, sealing her trophy inside. She wasn't the victim of a home invasion, she was the invasion, and the perfect tenant was just the perfect hunter. My old analog watch felt heavy on my wrist, a dead weight, another one, another body, another ghost to add to the growing legion rattling around inside my head. The wind picked up, a mournful howl, carrying with it the scent of death and the terrifying echo of a serene, unblinking gaze. I had to get out of here, before I became the next perfect tenant. The taste lingered on my tongue, metallic and strangely sweet, like a whisper of forbidden knowledge. Every bite had been a step closer to the abyss, and now, the flickering television screen in the motel room blared the headline, painting the horror in stark, undeniable strokes. Missing family of 3. My stomach clenched, not with revulsion, but with a horrifying, self-loathing recognition. A cold, insidious truth was settling in my gut, one that made me want to claw my own skin off. It was the same taste, the same sick, guilty pleasure that whispered of unspeakable things. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to erase the image of the smiling man with blood on his hands. But his voice echoed in the hollow space behind my eyelids, offering mystery meatloaf. The words were a vile, culinary punchline, and I was the unwitting, complicit guest at the table. It had all started, as these things always do, with a perfectly normal, annoyingly persistent friend, a ridiculously cheap menu, and the deceptive scent of grease and false promise, pulling me into yet another corner of this twisted map I seemed fated to walk. The small town in Missouri was exactly the kind of place I usually went out of my way to avoid. Too many eyes, too many familiar faces, too many opportunities for the past to catch up or for new horrors to manifest. I preferred the anonymity of highways and rest stops, the transient nature of a life lived between truck stops and dilapidated motels. But my current gig, a graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town, had me stuck for the foreseeable future. A temporary prison, I told myself, just until the next payroll cleared and I could point the old pickup towards another horizon. The town itself was a postcard of American folksiness. All clapboard houses and the scent of pine needles from the nearby national park. People knew each other's names, or so it seemed, waving from porch swings and pickup trucks. It was the kind of community that made my skin crawl. Tight-knit usually meant too close for comfort, too many secrets buried beneath that manicured lawn of normalcy. Then, Sam's Smash Burgers and More showed up. A new joint, opened by some tourist who decided to plant roots. The talk around the warehouse break room was all about it, mostly positive, sprinkled with a few unsettling whispers. Weird taste. Found a hair. Thought I saw a ring. I'd heard it all before, the usual gripes about any new establishment. But then someone mentioned a tooth, a human molar, supposedly. That got my attention, not because I believed it, but because it had the distinct tang of the truly improbable, the kind of story that usually presaged a much nastier reality. The owner, Sam, a perpetually smiling man, had apparently dismissed it all as a conspiracy by the locals to keep outsiders out. A notion so ludicrous it almost looped back around to believable. Almost. Come on, Leo, man, you gotta try it, Trey insisted, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. Trey was another reason I was stuck here. He was my shift supervisor, a genuinely good guy who had taken a shine to me, despite my best efforts to remain a polite, professional enigma. He kept pushing, kept badgering, rattling off how amazing the food was. Seriously, dude, 15 times already, and I've never found anything weird. Sam's a good guy. He clasped his hands together in mock prayer, his eyes wide. I stared at him, my gaze lingering a moment too long on his friendly, open face. A cold sliver of memory snaked through me. The easy trust I'd once placed in a familiar face, only to find a hollow, monstrous imitation beneath. Mitch. Goddamn Mitch. The paranoia was a constant companion now, a low hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. It flared brightest when someone was too nice, too insistent. 15 times, I echoed, the words tasting like ash. You're either an idiot savant for cheap eats, or you've developed an iron constitution for local legends. Trey laughed, oblivious, and for a second, I felt a pang of something akin to guilt for my dark thoughts. He was just a regular guy. Probably. Okay. I relented, a sigh escaping me that tasted of resignation. Fine, but only to shut you up. And if I find a toenail in my fries, I'm blaming you. We shared a strained laugh, mine more of a grimace, and headed out. Buster was back at the motel. Thank God. No way I was dragging him into another potential nightmare. He was probably curled up on the passenger seat of the truck, waiting for me to emerge from another one of my self-inflicted detours into the bizarre. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual, a familiar comfort and a constant reminder of the burdens I carried. I checked my analog wristwatch, more out of habit than need, the second hand sweeping its eternal, indifferent arc. 5:10. Time meant nothing when you were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sam's Smash Burgers and More was something. From the outside, it looked like a repurposed roadside diner from the 70s, with a few sun-bleached picnic tables out front. The umbrellas faded like old bruises. Inside, it was clear what it had been: a laundromat, a brightly lit, slightly too clean laundromat, with a walled-off kitchen section where the massive commercial dryers once stood. The lingering scent of fabric softener was doing battle with the smell of sizzling grease, creating a bizarre olfactory cocktail. Laundry and burger, I muttered, shaking my head. Only in America. Trey, meanwhile, was already at the counter, beaming at the menu tacked up behind the register. It was short, a sparse list of classics: single, double, triple cheeseburgers, pork steak, house fries, fried pickles, and chili. Everything was listed at a shocking $2. $2. My cynical alarm bells started ringing like a fire truck. Nothing was that cheap without a catch. Nothing. The only things that came free in my world were pain and regret. This price felt like a challenge, an insult to the laws of economics, a blatant red flag fluttering in a non-existent breeze. "You go first," I told Trey, my stomach rumbling in protest against my unease. My appetite had a nasty habit of ignoring my brain's warnings. He ordered a double cheeseburger, house fries, and a fried pickle. Fried? A pickle? I managed, my brow furrowing. My brain was still trying to compute the economics of $2 everything. "Yo, Leo, wake up, man. Stop spacing out, weirdo." Trey laughed, lightly grabbing my shoulder. I flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the touch. My eyes narrowed, scanning his face for any tell, any flicker of something else. Nothing. Just Trey, good old oblivious Trey, my self-preservation instinct, honed by years of running from unseen things, was a nagging buzz in my skull. I felt like prey in a field of flowers, every petal a potential trap. I forced my attention back to the menu. $2 for anything. It screamed desperate or too good to be true, or both. My gaze lingered on the chili and fries. Can I get the chili and the fries?" I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. "Like, can you combine the two to make chili fries?" The man behind the counter, Sam, was an older guy, maybe early 60s, with a round, pleasant face and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His grin was wide, almost unnaturally so, like a mask that had been stretched too far. It brought a shiver down my spine, a faint echo of the chilling artistry I'd witnessed in that pristine, antique-filled house where beauty was just a mask for decay. Olivia, her house had been a meticulously curated tableau, just like this man's smile felt curated. "Certainly," Sam boomed, his voice ridiculously ebullient. "It'll be about 30 minutes, okay? We make everything fresh and hot." 30 minutes. For chili fries. It was a long time for a fast food joint, but if everything was indeed fresh, I nodded. Trey nodded, and we found a booth. The booths were red vinyl, worn smooth in patches, probably from decades of restless laundromat patrons. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glow on the already sterile-looking interior. We hadn't been sitting for long when the smell hit us. Not just the faint, battling odors of fabric softener and old grease. This was something else, a richer, deeper, more primal aroma. The scent of frying meat, yes, but also something earthy, almost gamey. It was intoxicating, a heavy, musky cloud that seemed to bypass my nose and go straight for some ancient lizard brain part of me. It instantly brought back a flood of half-formed memories, sensations more than images, a warmth, a feeling of security, a deep animal satisfaction. My mind, ever the masochist, immediately conjured a phantom ache, a memory of a time before the world went sideways. My father, a man I hadn't thought about in years, not willingly. He'd cooked, sometimes, big, hearty meals. I remembered the smile, broad and genuine, as he'd served up plates, my mother with her cheap camera, snapping photos. He dreamed of his own restaurant, a vision that had evaporated when the bank denied his loan. Then had come the bottles, the depression, the quiet house turning into a war zone, the fear that coiled in my gut every time I heard his heavy footsteps, the car wreck, the screaming, my mother kicking him out, the silence that followed, both blessed and damning. The universe, I reflected, was just a series of bad deals, one after another. No matter how good something smelled or felt, the price was always astronomical. 45 minutes later, not 30, a woman appeared, carrying our plates. She was young, maybe our age, with a perpetually tired expression that reminded me of my own face in the mirror most mornings. She placed the plates in front of us, and I found myself staring. The food looked artful. No, artful wasn't right. It looked perfect. The kind of perfect that felt wrong, like it had been designed by a surgeon, not a short-order cook. Every fry was placed with deliberate precision, every dollop of chili a miniature peak on a mountain range of golden potato. The cheese was melted exactly right, a shimmering blanket. It was immaculate, almost disturbingly so. "You see, bro, don't that shit look good?" Trey exclaimed, practically drooling. He lifted his burger, the cheese pulling in molten strings, the patties perfectly smashed, glistening with juice. The bun, too, was buttery, fluffy, with just the right amount of onion and lettuce peeking out. He was right. It looked impossibly good. Almost too good, like a prop in a horror movie, designed to lull the unsuspecting victim. The smile on Sam's face, wide and too bright, brought me back to Ethan, that charmer in the woods, whose appetites were far more particular than anyone could have guessed. He'd seemed so normal. This place felt the same. My chili fries were steaming, radiating a comforting warmth. The chili was thick, almost meaty, coating the fries perfectly. The fries themselves, despite being submerged in the concoction, were still stiff, crunchy on the outside, with soft, creamy potato on the inside. They were clearly hand-cut, thick and irregular, and coated in a seasoning that I couldn't quite place, familiar, yet alien. It prickled at the back of my throat, a subtle, addictive hum. I took a bite, then another, and another. The cascade of flavors was immediate, overwhelming, distracting. It was savory, rich, deeply umami, with a subtle sweetness that I couldn't pinpoint. My brain, usually a fortress of cynicism and paranoia, simply melted under the onslaught. It was delicious, horrifyingly, addictively delicious. For $2, the sheer absurdity of it should have been a red flashing light, but my senses were hijacked. I ate, shoveling the chili fries into my mouth, barely registering Trey's delighted slurping across from me. It was a compulsion, a need, a deep animal satisfaction that bordered on primal. The plate was almost empty before I even realized it. "Ha ha, told you this place is the best in town," Trey said, his mouth half full. "Yeah, no kidding," I mumbled, my voice thick. "This place, it's something else. The way the food was made, plated, immaculate. I'd believe it if this guy was a Michelin star chef." Trey just grinned. I don't know who Michelin is or why their stars matter, but this food is bussin'. He said it with unearned confidence, perfectly unironically, and for a moment, I almost laughed. Almost, but then the food hit me, a wave of post-meal lethargy and a strange, almost shameful satisfaction. It was like I'd just eaten something I shouldn't have, something forbidden. We finished, pushing the empty plates across the table. When we stood to return them to the counter, that's when I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible beneath the low hum of the laundromat dryers and the clatter from the kitchen. A muffled cry, like someone was trying to yell, but their voice was swallowed by something thick, heavy, a plea, a choked gasp. My blood ran cold. The comfortable haze from the food evaporated, replaced by a sudden, brutal clarity. My ears strained, trying to isolate the sound, to make sense of it. The desperate, muffled sounds from the kitchen clawed at the edges of my hearing, a familiar echo of that cold, dead whisper on the mountain pass, or the pleas I'd heard from behind sealed doors. The kind of sound that meant someone was in trouble. The kind of sound I usually ran from. My stomach nodded. Damn that reluctant conscience of mine. Hey, bro, I asked Trey, my voice low, barely a whisper. My hand went to my wrist, my fingers tracing the cold metal of my watch, a grounding tick. Do you hear that? It sounds like someone trying to yell. Trey paused, his brow furrowed. He tilted his head, listening, then he shrugged, dismissing it. Nah, I don't hear a thing. I think you're just crazy, 'cause I was right. And you're trying to find something wrong with this place. He laughed, a short, snickering sound. The kind of sound normal people made when faced with something abnormal. The kind of sound that made me want to scream. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. That I was just crazy. That my brain, perpetually haunted, was manufacturing horrors where none existed. It was easier to think that. It always was. Why would anyone risk this? Risk everything. For a $2 burger joint? The thought was too insane. Too monstrous. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the clinging dread. Let's just go, I said, my voice flat. My go bag, always packed in the truck, suddenly felt miles away, unreachable. As we reached the door, Sam, the owner, emerged from the kitchen. He was smiling again, that same too wide, stretched smile, but this time, something else was evident. His hand, as he waved us out, was covered in blood. Not just a smear, but a wet, glistening coat. Too much. Far too much for a normal kitchen accident. The smell of something metallic, coppery, distinct from the grease, wafted from him. It made my gorge rise. Come back later for our mystery meatloaf. Waikiki, he called out, his voice booming with exaggerated cheer. A macabre joke that only he seemed to understand. A cold shiver, colder than any winter wind, ran down my spine. This wasn't a joke. This was a statement. The metallic tang, the unsettling sweetness of the food, the muffled screams, the too cheap prices, the missing tooth, the bloody hand. It all clicked into place with horrifying, sickening clarity. Another farm, another harvest, just a different kind of meat, same in different cosmic butchers. The thought chilled me to the bone, not just because of the gruesome implication, but because it resonated with a deeper, more profound dread, a chilling echo of that impossible, boundless farm I'd glimpsed in my worst moments, where existence itself felt like nothing more than a carefully curated feeding ground for unspeakable things. I mumbled a goodbye, my voice catching in my throat, and practically dragged Trey out the door. My eyes scanned the street, searching for anything, anyone, but the world outside felt just as oblivious as Trey. This town, like so many others, was just a stage for the everyday monstrous. Last night, curled on the lumpy mattress in my motel room, I watched the local news. My stomach was still a churning knot of unease, my mind replaying the image of Sam's bloody hand, the echo of those muffled cries. The local news anchor, her face grim, reported, "A vacationing family of 3 went missing earlier this week in our little town. Their car was found at the junkyard with nothing but bloodstains inside it. If you have any information, please call our helpline." My gaze drifted from the TV screen to the empty food container on the bedside table. My chili fries, the sickeningly delicious $2 chili fries. The taste, the weird, addictive, unforgettable taste. I felt sick, bone deep, soul sick. My hands started to tremble. I closed my eyes, trying to force the question from my mind, but it hammered against the inside of my skull, a relentless, horrifying drumbeat. Am I crazy, or does human meat actually taste good? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in my gut, leaving a trail of ash and self-loathing. I refused to go back to that restaurant. I had to refuse, but a part of me, a dark, primal, disgusted part, knew the answer to that question, and it was the most horrifying truth of all. The shriek tore through the pre-dawn darkness, a sound I'd never heard before, nor wanted to hear again. It was a guttural, wet tearing, a strangled scream that curdled the blood, ending in a sound like 1,000 fingernails raking across bone. My breath hitched in my throat, a cold, metallic taste coating my tongue. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, the condensation from my panicked breathing frosting it over. And then I saw it. It shouldn't have been possible. No earthly creature could defy gravity with such effortless, terrible grace. The horse, that same goddamn shadow of a beast that had been stalking us all night, was there, just beyond the tree line, suspended. Its forelegs dangled uselessly, impossibly an inch or two above the damp earth, while the rest of its monstrous form, black as spilled ink, melted into the oppressive shadows of the jungle. Its eyes, those twin points of malevolent, burning light, were fixed on me. They weren't animal eyes. They were something ancient, something that had stared into the void and reflected it back. And in that moment, as the cabin's flimsy walls seemed to melt away, and the world outside became a stage for this impossible horror, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very bones, that I was no longer just an observer. I was the next act. A few days earlier, the Dominican sun had beaten down with the relentless, indifferent fury of a vengeful god, baking the asphalt until it shimmered, blurring the edges of the palm trees that stood like weary sentinels along the coastal road. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, knuckles white, the air conditioning in the borrowed sedan barely making a dent in the oppressive heat. Another pit stop in another forgotten corner of the world. Another attempt to outrun the shadow that clung to my heels like a loyal, horrific dog. This time, it was a half-baked notion of reconnecting with some ancient, distant family branch. The kind of sentimental nonsense I usually avoided like the plague. My so-called dad had orchestrated this, a man whose presence in my life was as fleeting and ill-defined as a wisp of smoke. He'd resurfaced with this grand idea of family bonding after decades of radio silence, insisting I visit his mother, my grandmother, in Santo Domingo. I'd gone along with it, against my better judgment, fueled by that stupid, cursed flicker of a conscience that sometimes got me into more trouble than any monster. It was a faint hope, I supposed, that maybe, just maybe, a change of scenery, a dip into something resembling normalcy, might somehow dislodge the barbed hooks that always seemed to keep me tethered to the abyss. A fool's errand, as always. My old analog wristwatch, the face scratched and worn from countless scrapes with oblivion, felt heavy against my wrist, a constant, tangible reminder of time marching on, carrying me closer to whatever fresh hell awaited. I checked it, not for the hour, but for the familiar weight, the cold metal against my skin, a minuscule anchor in a sea of dread. The island itself was a kaleidoscope of vibrant chaos. Santo Domingo, in particular, pulsed with a feverish energy that felt both exhilarating and utterly exhausting. The air hung thick with the sense of grilled plantains, exhaust fumes, and something indefinable, almost primal, that clung to the humid air. Music, loud and insistent, blared from every open doorway, a relentless soundtrack to the constant flow of bodies, bicycles, and beat-up cars. My grandmother, a woman whose eyes held a wisdom that seemed to stretch back through generations, spoke barely a lick of English, and my Spanish was rusty enough to qualify as an antique. Our conversations were a comical, frustrating dance of gestures, broken phrases, and long, understanding silences. She'd set me up in a ramshackle house with a few cousins I'd never met, Joseph, Reuben, Jonathan, and Yanya, while she stayed a few blocks away. It was a bizarre kind of freedom, a forced independence that left me adrift in a foreign landscape. The kind of independence that usually meant I was walking straight into a trap. I tried to blend in, to just exist. I wandered through crowded markets, the air thick with the murmur of 1,000 voices, the bright colors of exotic fruits assaulting my cynical eyes. I sat on beaches, the impossibly turquoise water lapping at my bare feet, trying to empty my mind of the memories that constantly clawed at the edges of my sanity. Sometimes, I'd join the local kids in a dusty, impromptu baseball game, swatting at a makeshift ball with a splintered stick, the sun a burning hammer on my neck. Those moments were fleeting reprieves, moments where I could almost pretend to be normal, to be simply a kid on a summer trip, not a man perpetually on the run from the things that slithered in the dark. But the pretense was thin, easily shattered by a sudden chill in the air, a shadow that moved just a little too fast, or the whisper of a name that wasn't mine. The long drives across the island were the worst. We'd pile into an ancient, rattling SUV, the hum of the engine a dull drone as the urban sprawl gave way to the relentless green of the countryside. Rolling hills, perpetually shrouded in a wispy, spectral mist in the early mornings, rose and fell like a sleeping giant's chest. Palm trees, their fronds like skeletal fingers, clawed at the perpetually blue sky, which seemed to stretch on forever, a vast, indifferent eye watching everything. The ocean, when we caught glimpses of it, was a sparkling, blinding expanse, its beauty so absolute it almost felt threatening, a reminder of how small and insignificant I was against such raw, untamed power. Every turn in the winding, narrow roads revealed another vista, another glimpse of what the locals called nature, but what I saw as a brooding, ancient presence. A forest wasn't just a collection of trees here, it was a hungry maw, ready to swallow you whole. The sheer wildness of the place made my skin crawl, a primal alarm bell ringing deep in my bones. It was the kind of beauty that hinted at unspeakable things lurking just beneath the surface, things that the human eye was not meant to see. One humid Friday, my cousins, Joseph, Reuben, Jonathan, and Yania, decided it would be a grand idea to venture out of Santo Domingo and spend the weekend in Santiago. I'd never been, and despite the knot of unease that had become my constant companion, a cynical curiosity, or perhaps just a morbid fatalism, nudged me along. After all, what fresh hell could Santiago possibly offer that I hadn't already stumbled into? The drive was long, the air in the car thick with the cloying sweetness of stale air freshener and the nervous energy of 5 teenagers. As the cityscape receded into the rearview mirror, the highway narrowed, becoming a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through an increasingly dense, almost suffocating, green. The forest here was different. Not just trees, but a wall of primeval growth, thick and unyielding, swallowing the light, pressing in on all sides. It felt like entering a different dimension, a realm where the rules of the civilized world had no sway, where things whispered from the impenetrable shadows, waiting. I traced the cracked face of my wristwatch, the seconds ticking by with an unnerving slowness. The silence outside the car, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cicada or the distant call of an unknown bird, felt less like peace and more like a held breath. We arrived well after dark. The cabin we'd rented was a single-story, rickety structure, its weathered wood almost glowing faintly in the dim beam of the SUV's headlights. It sat in a clearing carved roughly out of the suffocating embrace of the forest, utterly alone. No other lights glimmered in the distance. No hum of distant traffic. The nearest town, Joseph casually informed me, was maybe 4 or 5 miles away. 4 or 5 miles in this place felt like another continent. The isolation was absolute, a profound silence that made my ears ring, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of unseen insects. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but expectant, the kind of quiet that settled over a predator before it struck. My jacket felt heavier than usual, a familiar, comforting weight against the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That night, after a dinner of some local concoction that tasted suspiciously like fried cardboard, we huddled in the living room, the single lantern casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and distorted on the rough-hewn walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something vaguely metallic. Joseph, bless his naive heart, decided it was the perfect time to share local folklore. "You ever heard of the Gallipote, Leo?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes wide with mock terror. I grunted, already knowing where this was going. Every place had its boogeyman, its local superstition, its convenient explanation for the unexplainable. I'd met more than my share of real boogeymen. The made-up ones rarely impressed me. "It's like our Bigfoot," he continued, oblivious to my cynicism. "Or the chupacabra, a man who sold his soul to the devil. He can shapeshift, you know, into any animal. They say he prowls the forests at night, his eyes glowing like embers, stalking travelers." He leaned forward, the lantern light glinting off his earnest face. "One man walking home late swore he saw it. First it was just a donkey, standing in the path, silent. But as he got closer, its body, twisted, contorted, became something else. Eyes like fire, movements all wrong. He ran, said he heard hoofbeats chasing him right to his door. Then nothing. Vanished." I bit back a sarcastic retort. Great, another chatty local spirit. My mind, however, despite its general disdain for ghost stories, had already begun cataloging the details. Shape-shifting, glowing eyes, hoofbeats, donkeys or horses, drawn to isolated places. The subconscious part of my brain, the one that kept me alive, was already filing this under potential threats supernatural category. Wasn't belief, not yet, but a tactical assessment. If the Gallipote was real, how would it operate? What were its weaknesses? This was the weary observer at work, constantly cataloging, constantly preparing, even when every fiber of my being screamed that I just wanted to be left alone. Joseph's voice dropped to a near whisper. "They usually take the form of donkeys or horses, and they're drawn to places like this. Real isolated, you know?" "Yeah, okay," I mumbled, rolling my eyes for effect, trying to project an air of bored disbelief. The concept of a shape-shifting demon was, frankly, ridiculous. It sounded like something conjured up to scare children, not something that preyed on seasoned cynics like me. Still, the image of those glowing eyes lingered, an unsettling flicker behind my eyelids. After his story finally petered out, I declared myself done with the campfire tales and headed to bed, desperate to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. It was barely past midnight, but the silence outside, a deep, resonant hum, felt like it was pressing in on the fragile walls of the cabin, promising to crush us all. At precisely 3 a.m., nature, with its exquisite timing, decided to make its demands known. I shoved myself out of the shallow, uneasy sleep I'd managed to snatch. Every joint in my body ached. a chronic weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The cabin was a single-story affair, long and narrow like a shotgun shack, with an infuriating abundance of large windows that offered an almost unobstructed 360-degree view of the surrounding forest. Great, I thought, perfect for observing whatever decides to come knocking. I shuffled down the dim hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor, heading for the bathroom. The air was colder here, much colder than it had any right to be. It wasn't a sudden drop in temperature, more like a slow, insidious seep crawling under the door frames, oozing through the very walls. I shivered, pulling my worn leather jacket tighter around me, a habit even in sleep. As I made my way back from the bathroom, the hallway seemed to stretch, the shadows deepen. I passed one of the biggest windows, a massive pane of glass that dominated the front of the house. My eyes, still bleary, instinctively flicked towards it and froze. It was there, at the very edge of the tree line, barely visible against the inky blackness of the jungle, stood a horse. Its coat was an impossible shade of black, deeper than the night itself, a pure absence of light that seemed to absorb the faint glow of the distant stars. It wasn't grazing, wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything a normal horse would do. It was unnervingly, impossibly still, and its eyes weren't the soft, liquid pools of an animal. They gleamed with a strange, malevolent intensity, 2 points of amber fire that bored into me with an unsettling, predatory focus. The air around it felt heavy, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath, amplifying the terrifying silence. "What the hell?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat, a dry rasp. I squeezed my eyes shut, rubbing them roughly with the heels of my hands, a desperate, childish hope that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my exhaustion. But when I opened them again, it was still there, still staring, still unnervingly still. My heart, a panicked drum against my ribs, lurched into a frantic gallop. A cold and a clammy sweat broke out on my forehead, stinging my eyes. Every nerve in my body screamed, a primal instinct to flee, to vanish. I didn't think. I reacted. I bolted back to my room, stumbling over my own feet in the desperate rush. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my retina. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, burning my lungs. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand trembling so violently I almost missed it. The harsh overhead light flooded the small room, doing little to dispel the lingering terror. Jonathan, sprawled on his cot, snored softly. "Jonathan!" I hissed, my voice a strangled whisper, laced with an urgency that, even to my own ears, sounded unhinged. I shook him, hard. "Wake up! You're not going to believe this!" My words spilled out in a rush, a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. "There's a horse, outside. It's staring," he grumbled, swatting my hand away. But the sheer panic in my voice must have cut through his sleep-addled brain. He finally pushed himself up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, a look of annoyed skepticism on his face. "A horse? Leo? What are you talking about?" But he got up, that flicker of reluctant concern overriding his disbelief. We crept back down the hallway, each step feeling impossibly loud in the dead silence of the cabin. My wristwatch felt like a lead weight, ticking off the agonizing seconds until the next confrontation. We reached the window. My gaze snapped to the edge of the woods, and there it was. Only this time, it was closer, much closer. It had moved, silently, impossibly, perhaps 20 yards closer to the cabin's flimsy walls. Its eyes, those twin infernos, seemed to burn even brighter, fixed on us now. "What the?" Jonathan whispered, his face, usually a mask of youthful indifference, now ashen, drained of all color. His voice was barely a breath, but it was enough. The sight, The impossible stillness, the burning eyes had shattered his skepticism. That was all the validation I needed. My internal red alert system, a finely tuned instrument of survival honed by years of running from things that shouldn't exist, went into overdrive. "Get up, all of you, now!" I didn't whisper this time. My voice was a harsh, insistent command, cutting through the silence like a knife. I ran through the cabin, shaking Reuben, Joseph, and Yanya awake, rattling off frantic, half-formed explanations. They stumbled out of their rooms, bleary-eyed and annoyed, complaining loudly about being woken in the middle of the night. But as they approached the window, drawn by the frantic energy emanating from Jonathan and me, the horse was gone. The edge of the forest was just that, a wall of impenetrable darkness. No impossible black shape, no glowing eyes, nothing. "You're probably just seeing things, Leo," Yanya muttered, rubbing her eyes, her voice laced with annoyance. "Or dreaming." Joseph and Reuben nodded, clearly thinking I'd lost my mind. I was starting to believe them, to question my own sanity, to wonder if the isolation and the sheer stress of my existence were finally catching up to me. The familiar cold dread, the kind that whispered, "See, Leo, you're crazy. It's always just you," began to coil in my stomach. Then we all heard it, the shriek. It wasn't a neigh. It wasn't a horse's sound at all. It was a vile, guttural, utterly inhuman sound that began like a strangled horse's cry, then morphed into something akin to a cat's scream, amplified 1,000 times, laced with a predatory malice that scraped against the very fabric of my soul. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that violated every natural law. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, a prickling sensation that crawled down my spine. The cousins froze, their faces now mirroring Jonathan's earlier pallor, their eyes wide with a dawning horror. The air crackled, thick with an almost palpable dread. I didn't hesitate. My feet, seemingly operating independently of my conscious thought, propelled me back to the largest window in my room, the one where I'd first seen the creature. It was a compulsion, a sick, morbid fascination that often seized me in moments of extreme terror. I had to see it. I had to know. And there it was. Again. The horse. But this time, it was no longer on the ground, no longer merely standing. It was levitating. I'm not exaggerating. I've seen things, too many things. Things that defy logic, things that warp reality. But this was new. The impossible black shape was suspended in the air, a few feet off the forest floor. I could only see its front legs, dangling like broken marionette strings, in part of its monstrous obsidian body. The rest was swallowed by the impenetrable darkness of the woods, as if the creature was emerging from a tear in reality itself. It didn't float, it hung there, impossibly still, an affront to every law of physics. Its eyes, those burning embers, seemed to pulsate with an inner light, fixed directly on me through the glass. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of pure terror tightening in my chest. The cabin suddenly felt impossibly small, impossibly fragile. My cousins crowded around me, a sudden huddle of terrified humanity, their wide eyes reflecting the monstrous spectacle outside. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe. The collective, horrified silence was deafening. Then, with an unnerving, almost graceful fluidity, the horse began to back away. Its movements were too smooth, too deliberate for an animal. It simply glided backward, its legs still dangling uselessly until it was fully absorbed by the pre-dawn shadows, vanishing as utterly as if it had never been there. The profound silence that followed was even more terrifying than the shriek, a confirmation that something unspeakable had just occurred. None of us slept that night, not a wink. We huddled together, whispering, or more often, just staring at the windows, listening to the insidious silence of the forest. I stayed by the largest window, my worn leather jacket pulled tight, the familiar weight of my wristwatch a cold comfort against my clammy skin. Every rustle of leaves, every distant chirp, every shifting shadow sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my exhausted body. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, trying to dismiss it as a shared hallucination, a trick of the light, anything but the truth. But the memory of those glowing eyes, that impossibly suspended body, refused to be rationalized away. It was a new layer of horror, etched onto the already scarred landscape of my psyche. When the first slivers of harsh, unforgiving sunlight finally pierced through the canopy of trees, casting long, stark shadows across the clearing, we were already packing. We'd planned to stay the entire weekend, but the unspoken consensus was clear. Staying another minute was an act of suicidal folly. We mumbled some flimsy excuse about running out of supplies to my grandmother when we finally made it back to Santo Domingo. The lie a thin veil over the raw terror that still clung to us. None of us mentioned the horse. Some horrors are too profound, too fundamentally world-shattering to share. Years have passed since that impossible night in Santiago, but the memory, vivid and horrifying, clings to me like a second skin. It's not just the sight of the levitating beast, though that image is seared into my brain like a brand. It's the profound shift it triggered within me. Another chip in the fragile dam holding back the terrifying truth of the universe. Before that night, I dismissed folklore, local legends, as mere stories, quaint superstitions to entertain or scare children. But seeing that thing, that impossible thing, shattered that illusion. It tore away the comfortable veil of skepticism, revealing a glimpse of the vast, unknowable darkness that truly exists just beyond the edges of our perceived reality. The thought of how many other legends, how many other whispers of old wives' tales might hold such a terrifying kernel of truth sends a fresh wave of ice-cold dread through me. It's a weight that settles deeper into my bones with every new horror I stumble into. Another confirmation that I am somehow, inexplicably, a magnet for the macabre. Just my luck, right? The memory of that horse, its piercing, malevolent eyes and otherworldly presence, still haunts my waking hours and invades my restless sleep. It's a chilling reminder that the unknown isn't just out there. It's often much closer than we dare to imagine. Watching, waiting, sometimes even taking the form of the mundane before twisting it into something monstrous. I sometimes find myself sketching a new, nervous habit, trying to put the shapes of these things onto paper, as if giving them form might somehow lessen their power over me. But the horse, that nightmare of black and fire, refuses to be contained. I still visit the Dominican Republic occasionally, for some distant, lingering family obligation or just another transient job, a way to disappear and reappear without drawing too much attention. But Santiago? Hell no. You won't catch me within 100 miles of that godforsaken jungle. I'll stick to the bustling capital, where the chances of seeing a levitating horse are, by my own grim calculations, basically zero. Which, for me, probably means it's only a matter of time until something else equally impossible finds me. It always does. Total character count, 9948. The phone was slick in my hand, a cold and unresponsive brick against my ear. The line had gone dead, but the echo of that laughter, that thing's laughter, still rattled in the cavern of my skull. It wasn't human, not even close. It was a sound like grinding bone and crumbling stone, a dry, ancient mirth that spoke of eons spent harvesting the unseen, the immeasurable. My chest felt hollowed out, a gaping void where something vital used to reside, a phantom ache, a chilling emptiness that was far worse than any physical wound. Insufficient currency. The words reverberated, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile fortress of my sanity. How did you replenish a soul? And what, precisely, did it mean to be bankrupt of it? The answer, I suspected, was far more terrifying than the question. It all started, as these things always do, with something small and innocuous. A misplaced sense of civic duty, or perhaps just a festering irritation at the sheer, unbridled chaos that seemed to metastasize around me. No matter how many miles I put between myself and the last nightmare, I'd found myself in another fleeting pit stop, a tired, anonymous apartment on the fringes of what was once a respectable uptown neighborhood. I'd taken a night shift at a nondescript warehouse on the industrial edge of town, the kind of place where the drone of the forklifts was a symphony of modern ennui, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear into the background hum of the world. It paid the bills, kept me fed, and ensured I was out of sync with most of humanity, just the way I liked it. And Buster, my scruffy, loyal anchor to whatever shreds of normalcy I still clung to, seemed content enough with our sporadic, late-night walks, his nose twitching at every scent that promised escape from the concrete jungle. The problem, if you could even call it that initially, was Sally. She'd materialized, seemingly overnight, in the yard of my next-door neighbor, a woman named Cardinal. Cardinal was an archetype I'd come to recognize. The well-meaning, slightly chaotic, bleeding heart, perpetually optimistic, perpetually blind to the darker currents flowing just beneath the surface of things. Her yard was a testament to her particular brand of unkempt benevolence, a riot of rainbow flags fluttering alongside overgrown vegetables, haphazardly discarded children's toys, and an abundance of what she enthusiastically described as pretty crystals unearthed from the riverbanks. To my cynical eye, they were just rocks, probably scraped off the bottom of a polluted waterway. But I'd learned long ago that arguing with willful delusion was a waste of breath. We had a truce, Cardinal and I. She'd offer me questionable garden tomatoes and invite me to her backyard barbecues, and I'd shovel her sidewalk when the snow turned the world into a treacherous, gleaming white sheet. A transactional peace born of mutual convenience, until Sally pitched her tent. I'd spotted the splash of garish nylon one evening, just as the last sliver of bruised purple light bled from the sky. My hand automatically went to the worn leather of my jacket, tracing the familiar seams, a nervous habit. "Kids camping out?" I'd asked, trying for a casual tone that tasted like ash in my mouth. My gut had already begun to clench, that familiar warning thrumming low in my veins, the kind that used to accompany the unsettling silence before a whisper from a snow-choked mountain pass, or the glint in a charming stranger's eye that promised something far more unsettling than hospitality. Cardinal, oblivious, had beamed. "Oh, that's my friend Sally. She's just staying a few days, till she gets back on her feet." She'd seen the storm clouds, though, the faint tightening around my eyes, because she quickly added, "It's just a few days. Leo, she lost her job, but she'll find a place. She's a good woman." "Uh-huh," I'd muttered, the words caught in the back of my throat. A few days. That was always how it started. A few days could stretch into an eternity, a slow, creeping horror that dug its roots deep into the foundation of your life before you even realized what was happening. I'd seen a few days turn into a skin carpet stitched from human flesh, or a pleasant dinner party morph into a charnel house. My analog wristwatch, its face scratched and worn, suddenly felt heavy on my wrist. I checked the time, though I barely registered the hands. Just a small, physical anchoring in a world that insisted on drifting into the bizarre. Weeks bled into a month. Sally's tent, originally a vibrant, almost cheerful magenta, had begun to sag, bleached by the sun, streaked with grime. It was no longer a temporary shelter. It was taking on the air of a permanent fixture, a malignant growth in Cardinal's already chaotic garden. Piles of junk accumulated around it like decaying organs. Warped bicycle tires, splintered wooden crates, a headless mannequin draped in what looked suspiciously like an old shower curtain. Sally herself, a frumpy woman with perpetually tear-filled, mousy eyes and an air of nervous fragility, claimed these were her materials. She was an artist, she'd explained once, her voice a reedy whisper, transforming other people's junk into something beautiful. She'd even offered to make me a sculpture for my yard, a favorite animal from found objects. I'd looked at the sprawling mess, the odd, distorted shapes she'd already constructed, a bird with bent license plates for wings, a lopsided dog made of rusted metal scraps, and a wave of nausea, cold and acidic, had washed over me. Beauty. The word tasted like a lie. I'd seen what passed for beauty in the wrong hands. The meticulously arranged displays of what should never be seen. The pristine surfaces that hid unspeakable horrors. My mind, unbidden, flashed to Olivia, the skin carpet lady, her house a monument to a twisted aesthetic, every object imbued with a sinister provenance. That memory was a fresh, still weeping wound. I barely managed to suppress a shudder. "How's the housing search going?" I'd asked, my voice flat, trying to steer the conversation away from her macabre art. She'd sighed, a pathetic, wavering sound, and mumbled something about social workers and how everywhere was full. Just as I expected, the city was no help either. This place, like so many others I'd passed through, prided itself on being progressive, which often translated to a municipal blind eye turned towards anything that smacked of disruptive social issues. Loitering laws were gone. Native plants, a fancy name for weeds, were encouraged. A homeless encampment in your neighbor's yard? Probably a creative expression of marginalized communities. My cynicism, a well-worn comfort, settled around me like my old leather jacket. I was stuck. Stuck with the tent. Stuck with the encroaching menagerie of garbage animals. Stuck in a situation I couldn't simply walk away from. Not yet. Not while Buster was here, enjoying his routine, innocent of the creeping dread that had begun to infest our new, temporary home. Then, the junkman. I'd seen the flyers tacked to telephone poles, stapled to bus stop shelters, even slipped under my own windshield wiper one morning when I was leaving for work. Stark, blocky letters. "Junkman, will take any junk. Call X Ashen." Occasionally, I'd caught glimpses of the figure, a stooped, almost skeletal silhouette pushing a rickety cart laden with derelict appliances, shattered fences, or rust-eaten bikes. Who was this person? What was their game? There was no fee listed, which was the strangest part of all. No one did anything for free, not in my experience. The universe demanded a price. Always. One sweltering afternoon, as the air hung thick and humid, tasting of ozone and impending summer storms, I spotted the junkmen again. They were wrestling a fresh flyer onto a telephone pole near Cardinal's house, their form obscured by the heat haze rising from the pavement. Without thinking, a sarcastic quip slipped past my lips. "Hey, I got some junk you can take out." I thumbed toward Sally's tent, its lopsided sculpture shimmering mockingly in the oppressive heat. The junkmen paused, then slowly, almost impossibly, rotated their head over a bony shoulder. That's when I saw it, the face. Or what passed for one. It was a woman. Yes, or had been once. But time and something else had warped her features. Wild, tangled gray hair framed a face as pale and papery as old parchment. Her lips were a startling, unnatural ruby red, like fresh blood on snow. But it was her eyes that truly seized me. They were large, black, and utterly devoid of anything human. They seemed to possess a predatory intelligence, a depthless void that drew you in, much like the hollow gaze of an owl preparing to strike. Her head was tilted, almost detachedly, as if it could simply keep turning, like a screw perpetually winding down that turkey-thin neck. My stomach lurched. The cold dread that had become my constant companion since the days of The Man in the Walls and the hideous impersonation of Mitch solidified into a leaden weight. This was no ordinary eccentric. This was something else. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, raspy whisper, like leaves scuttling across barren ground. The art or the artist? I let out a short, incredulous laugh, trying to mask the sudden tremor in my hands. Well, if you can take the artist, please do. Been mucking up my view for a month now. It was a throwaway comment, a cynical joke born of irritation, but the junkman simply nodded, that impossible head bobbing slightly. Hey, I blurted, a sudden desperate need to categorize, to normalize, rising in me. How come you call yourself Junkman if you're a woman? Better for business, she rasped, her voice devoid of inflection. No one will call an old woman to haul junk. Fair enough, I thought, even as my instincts screamed, run. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. I clutched my wristwatch, rubbing the cold metal against my thumb, trying to ground myself. Then, she simply turned and shambled away, another transient shadow dissolving into the humid afternoon, leaving only the memory of those inhuman eyes. A few days later, a commotion erupted in Cardinal's yard. Her voice, usually so cheerful, was laced with a frantic, rising panic. Sally, Sally, where are you? I watched from my living room window, pulling back the dusty curtain just enough to peer out. Cardinal was pacing, her hands fluttering like agitated birds, her brow furrowed with concern. Sally, it seemed, had vanished, poof, like smoke. Yet all her possessions remained, the tattered tent, the piles of grotesque art. My initial thought was simple. Winter was coming, and Sally had probably just packed up and moved on, leaving poor, gullible Cardinal to clean up her mess. It was the sensible, logical explanation, the one I preferred to believe, despite the unsettling memory of the junkman's owl-like gaze. When Cardinal finally approached my door, her eyes wide and worried, I tried to keep my face neutral. Everything all right? I asked, leaning against the doorframe, my hand casually reaching for my jacket pocket, where my go-bag's key was always within reach. It's Sally, she's just gone. Cardinal wrung her hands. And all her things are still here. Do you think, should we call the junkman? To deal with the tent, maybe? Cheaper than a dumpster? The mention of the junkman sent a chill crawling up my spine, a sensation I hadn't felt so acutely since that horrifying realization that the pig creature was not just a beast, but a distorted reflection of my own deepest fears. I almost recoiled, but then managed to compose myself. The junk man, I echoed, trying to sound genuinely surprised. Cardinal's eyes narrowed. Oh my gosh, was she around here? I keep tearing down her posters. She's bad news. Haven't you heard the rumors? When I shook my head, affecting ignorance, Cardinal leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the very air was listening. I don't like to speak ill of people, but my friend Joan, she said her ex-boyfriend hated her dog and asked the junkman to take it. The next day it disappeared. She'll take anything. They say she uses some sort of witchcraft and takes a piece of your soul in exchange for disappearing the junk. There's all these extra terms and conditions written in invisible ink on her flyers. Look at them under a black light if you want to freak yourself out. Huh, I said, my voice barely audible. A piece of your soul. That wasn't witchcraft. That was something far older, far more insidious. My mind immediately leapt to the whispers I'd heard in that strange, horrific farm. The taste of ash in my mouth and the knowledge that something out there saw us not as beings, but as livestock, our very essence a commodity. The NDE, that terrifying glimpse behind the veil, had stripped me of any illusion of a benevolent universe. A piece of your soul. It was the kind of payment that, to me, now seemed terrifyingly plausible. But then, the rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive this long by forcing me to ignore the truly impossible, kicked in. Coincidence. Sally was a transient. People disappeared. The junkman was probably just some incredibly efficient, discreet junk hauler. The rumors were just that. Rumors fueled by small-town superstition. My pragmatic, cynical self wanted to believe that it was safer. Then, I found the gift. It was placed neatly on my front step. Nestled beside the welcome mat, a small, intricate sculpture of a deer, not made of polished bronze or finely carved wood, but of discarded, rusted bicycle chains, twisted wire, and shards of broken glass that caught the afternoon light in a malevolent glint. It was one of Sally's creations, no doubt. Attached to it, a small, crisp card, the kind you'd get from a high-end business. In elegant, looping script, "Thanks for your business, Junkman." What a creeper. I picked it up with 2 fingers, a grimace on my face, and promptly tossed it into my outdoor garbage can. The deer, with its hollow, glass eyes, seemed to watch me, accusingly, from the depths of the bin. Cardinal, bless her bleeding heart, eventually cleared away Sally's tent. But the garden, in her peculiar philosophy, was still an expression of Sally's spirit, and so the found object animals remained. The most egregious offender was an eagle, its wings fashioned from discarded fan blades, gleaming, lethal-looking metal, poised as if about to swoop directly onto my porch. It was an affront to my tired eyes, a constant, nagging reminder of the encroaching chaos I tried to escape. I hadn't planned to call the junk man. My initial revulsion had been genuine, but the number scribbled on the back of the junk man's card kept nagging at me. It felt like a low-grade infection, something you knew was bad for you, but was so easy to scratch. The eagle was a daily provocation. Finally, one restless night, unable to sleep, the memory of that razor-winged bird flapping in my mind, I succumbed. I picked up the phone, a low, guttural click, then a raspy, dry voice on the voicemail. "Leave a message explaining what junk you'd like removed. The fee is merely a small sliver of your soul." I laughed, a harsh, humorless bark into the receiver. Hilarious. A joke. Just a bizarre, twisted marketing ploy. "Yeah," I muttered. "I'd like the metal eagle sculpture removed from the yard next door, and any other art in the vicinity. Thanks." I hung up, a strange mix of relief and unease settling over me. The next morning, the eagle was gone, along with the lopsided dog, the bird with license plate wings, and every other piece of Sally's art. The yard, still messy, was at least free of the metallic monstrosities. Whoa. My first thought was disbelief, followed by a surge of something akin to admiration. Forget witchcraft. This was just efficiency. No fuss, no muss. All I had to do was make a phone call. It was too easy. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Things that were too easy always came with a hidden cost, a price tag you only saw after the transaction was complete. It reminded me of the effortless way Ethan, the charming cannibal, had lured his victims, their complacency, their undoing. I told myself I wouldn't call again, but the insidious convenience had taken root. I'd see things around town. 2 doors down, an elderly couple had left rusted, broken appliances on their porch for months, making the whole street look like a junkyard. One phone call, gone the next morning. Then there were the panhandlers. My new routine included walking Buster past the co-op where I shopped. Every damn day, they were there, sprawled on the sidewalk, signs held aloft, harassing customers, making everyone uncomfortable. What are people like that but trash? I'd thought, my cynicism curdling into open contempt. A problem, a nuisance, another phone call, and then new faces appeared the next day. Same spot. So I called again. The process became a compulsion. Graffiti scarring the brick walls of the apartment complex? Gone. Dog owners who let their animals foul the sidewalk, leaving their steaming offerings for the unsuspecting pedestrian? Gone. Even a gang of thrill-seeking teens who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood, stealing Kias and doing donuts in the intersection? Gone. Each time, I'd receive another of Sally's grotesque, found object sculptures on my doorstep. a silent, unsettling receipt, a broken toy car, twisted into the shape of a dog, a mangled license plate shaped like a bird. Always the same crisp card. Thanks for your business, Junkman. The collection of these macabre trophies was growing in a box under my bed. I told myself it was for research, but deep down, I knew it was a grim testament to the pieces of myself I was trading away. The hollowness inside me was deepening. Each removed nuisance filled a brief void, but left a greater one behind. Everything was great, or as great as anything ever got in my cursed existence. Until yesterday. The knock on my door was sharp, insistent, cutting through the usual drone of my apartment building. I pulled open the door to find Cardinal standing there, her face uncharacteristically pale, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. In her hand, clutched like a damning piece of evidence, was a small, crudely fashioned dog sculpture, one of Sally's creations. It took me a moment, my mind still sluggish with sleep, to realize she'd picked it up from my front step, and attached to it, of course, was the Junkman's familiar card. "The Junkman," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl I'd never heard from her before. Her eyes, usually so soft and kind, now pierced me with an unnerving intensity. "You've been calling the Junkman. Why does she leave Sally's sculptures for you as a calling card? Did you call her about Sally? Are you the reason Sally disappeared? I'm keeping this sculpture, something to remember her, seeing as all the other art I had of hers out in my yard has gone missing, along with so many other things that, I guess, were junk. To you." Her gaze swept past me, taking in the clean, ungraffitied walls of the apartment building, the absence of lingering homeless, the lack of dog waste on the sidewalk, a silent accusation. "Now, hang on," I started, my mind racing, trying to construct a defense, a plausible lie. But what was there to say? The proof was right there in her hand, the very symbol of my complicity. She stormed off my porch, the dog sculpture held tight. Over her shoulder, her voice sharp as glass, she shouted, "Whatever happens, Leo, you brought this on yourself." Leo, she'd used my name, not the casual neighbor or Frank that some used. It hit me harder than the accusation itself. She knew, or she suspected enough. A cold, visceral fear, far more potent than anything I'd felt from the creatures of the night, seized me. This was human fear, the fear of exposure, of consequences, of the mundane world crashing down. I rushed back inside, my hands trembling as I snatched up my phone. I had to, didn't I? She had the card. If she called first, if she called and told the junk man to take me, the thought was a sickening plunge into an icy abyss. Her or me. It was always a choice between two bad things in my life. A lifetime of running, of being hunted, had taught me that survival was paramount. It was her or me. My fingers flew across the keypad, punching in the number, a desperate prayer forming on my lips, though I hadn't prayed in years. The ringing was excruciatingly long, each pulse of the dial tone a thudding echo of my own frantic heartbeat. When the raspy voice answered with its familiar, chilling voicemail, I didn't hesitate. "I need you to remove Cardinal, my neighbor. She's a nuisance." The words tasted like ash. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, and my chest felt tight, empty, hollowed out. But I'd done it. The choice was made. The next morning, I sat on my porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in my hand. My eyes, weary and bloodshot, were fixed on Cardinal's house. I saw her children first, her youngest bouncing out the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, sprinting for the school bus as if every day were a sun-drenched adventure. Shit, I'd completely forgotten about them. The junk man took anything? Did anything include children? The thought made the coffee churn in my stomach. Then, a few minutes later, Cardinal herself emerged. She paused on her porch, her lips thinning when she noticed me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She pointedly looked away, overtly ignoring me, a deliberate slight, still pissed at me, and also still very much not disappeared. Why? Why had the junkmen not taken her away? My panic ratcheted up another notch. Had my call gone through, or had she, somehow, beaten me to it? The thought that I might have condemned myself, without even the small comfort of seeing my problem disappear, was intolerable. I called again, and again. I left several messages, each one more frantic than the last, my voice raspy with growing desperation. "Did you get my message? What's going on? Is she gone?" Finally, on my fifth call, I was met not by the disembodied voicemail, but by the junkman's actual voice. It was unexpected, unnerving. That dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper on bone. "Your messages were received," it grated. "So what's going on?" I demanded, barely containing the tremor in my voice. "Did Cardinal call first and ask you to junk me?" The thought was pure, unadulterated terror. "She has never called this number," the voice replied, devoid of inflection, "and never will." A wave of bewildering relief washed over me, quickly replaced by confusion. "Okay, well, can I ask why you didn't carry out my request?" "You have insufficient currency," said the voice, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the price of milk. Wait, but there's no charge," I exclaimed, indignation momentarily overriding my terror. This was a scam. Then, new fees. Just when I needed the service most. But even as I said it, the phrase echoed in my mind, the one I dismissed each time I heard it on the voicemail. "A small sliver of your soul." The junkman chuckled then, a low, dry sound that started as a rustle and deepened, slowly, horribly, into something else entirely. It didn't sound like an old woman's voice at all anymore. Didn't sound remotely human. It was a sound like rocks grinding together, like the slow, inexorable shift of tectonic plates, ancient and indifferent. It kept chuckling, deeper and deeper, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, threatening to unravel the frayed edges of my sanity. "There is a charge. Leo Vance," the voice articulated, each syllable drawn out, dripping with chilling finality. "Each transaction has a small cost. You have made a number of transactions, and now you have insufficient currency." The laughter trailed off now, dissolving into peals of terrible, awful mirth, a sound that echoed the NDE, the cosmic indifference of the universe, and the knowledge that everything had a price. My hand flew to the phone, slamming it down, cutting off the last vestige of that horrifying sound. And now here I am, sitting on my porch, the sun a cold lie on my skin, the taste of ash in my mouth. Buster, sensing my distress, nudges my hand with his wet nose, a soft, worried whimper escaping him. I pat his head mechanically, but my gaze is fixed on Cardinal's porch, then on the neatly swept sidewalks, the absent panhandlers, the ungraffitied walls, all the things I had wished away, all the junk I had so carelessly, so selfishly traded for. How do I earn back my currency? Is there any way to reverse the charges? If each time the fee was a small sliver of your soul, what does that mean? Now, when she tells me I have insufficient currency, what happens when you owe a debt that cannot be paid in blood, or tears, or money? What happens when the collector comes for the rest? And what exactly is the rest? Total character count 9789. Luke. My voice was a thin, reedy thing, swallowed by the sudden, cavernous silence that had fallen over the house. The upstairs bedroom reeked of copper and fear, the traumatized man whimpering in the corner, clutching himself like he was trying to hold his own sanity together. Downstairs, the crash still echoed in my bones. vibrating through the splintered floorboards beneath my worn work boots. My heavy-duty maglite, clutched in a white-knuckled grip, danced nervously across the shattered window, then back to the open bedroom door, a gaping maw of darkness that had swallowed Luke whole. No shouts, no gunshots, just an unnatural, suffocating quiet that pressed in on me, stealing the very air from my lungs. My breath hitched, tasting ash and something metallic. This wasn't just another bad call. This was the moment the world ripped open, and I was staring into the void, utterly, irrevocably alone, the cold dread coiling in my stomach like a dying viper. But isolation wasn't new to me. In fact, it was the only constant I allowed, a self-imposed exile that had served me well until now. This night, however, had begun like any other godforsaken graveyard shift, a relentless march of minutes punctuated only by the hum of anonymous machinery and the distant, unsettling wail of a siren that promised something had gone very wrong. Very far away, the cheap plastic crackle of the police scanner, nestled on the passenger seat of my beat-up sedan, had been my only company for the last 6 hours. I was pushing midnight, almost done with another soul-crushing night delivering forgotten freight to an empty warehouse outside of Havenwood. My worn leather jacket felt like a second skin, a comfortable weight against the chill that perpetually clung to my bones, regardless of the temperature. My left thumb idly traced the cool metal of my old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I'd picked up somewhere along the desolate stretches of highway that defined my life. Not that I cared what time it was. Time had become a meaningless concept, just another arbitrary division of a life I was merely enduring. All units on duty, we've got a 10 to 56 at 3207 Black Hollow Lane. Caller reports something outside her home. Approach with caution. The dispatcher's voice, sharp and clipped, cut through the white noise. It was a small-town station, usually quiet enough to hear the bored yawn of the night shift. But tonight, there was a faint hum of static, punctuated by hurried, muffled voices in the background, as if something more sinister lingered just out of earshot. The stillness of the station behind her voice felt foreboding, as though the night itself was holding its breath. My jaw tightened. A 1056 disturbance. Could be anything. A raccoon, a teenager with a prank. Or it could be something else entirely. The kind of something else that had a habit of finding me, no matter how far I ran. My cynicism, usually a comforting blanket, suddenly felt threadbare. I had learned, through bitter experience, that the mundane often served as an elaborate stage for the truly horrific. I shouldn't have been listening to the scanner. I shouldn't have been within 5 miles of Havenwood. But my last delivery had ended earlier than expected, and I was just killing time. The engine idling, waiting for the night to bleed into a gray, forgettable dawn. And then the call came. Black Hollow Lane. I knew the area. It was where the town faded into wilderness, where streetlights grew sparse and shadows deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of civilization. A reluctant sigh escaped my lips. My conscience, that persistent, irritating little ember that refused to be extinguished no matter how much ash life piled on it, began to stir. I could ignore it, drive away. My go bag was in the trunk, already packed. No one would know. But the dispatcher's tone, the undercurrent of unease, had snagged something in me. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through me, a primal awareness of something wrong. I hated it. I hated the pull, the undeniable urge to investigate, to see, to know. It was a self-destructive impulse, my fatal flaw, consistently dragging me into situations I knew I should avoid. Damn it, I muttered, more to myself than the empty passenger seat. My hand, as if with a will of its own, had already shifted into drive. The old sedan rumbled to life, the tires crunching softly on the gravel of the warehouse lot. The road to Black Hollow Lane was a tunnel of shifting shadows. Each turn felt heavier, the trees looming like skeletal fingers against a bruised sky. The occasional flicker of a streetlight cast fleeting shapes that lingered too long, making me glance twice, my peripheral vision playing tricks. A soft hum of wind carried faint whispers, like words just out of reach, adding a foreboding weight to the already charged air. The roads felt deserted, every rustle of leaves, every distant creak of branch against branch, amplified. It wasn't unusual for bizarre calls to come in during the witching hours, but something about the dispatcher's voice, sharper, urgent, had made my skin prickle, a sensation that had become a precursor to disaster. I found Luke's cruiser parked a few yards from the address. Luke was a young deputy, barely out of the academy, all wide-eyed optimism and freshly pressed uniform. I'd seen him around, grabbing coffee at the same greasy spoon I sometimes haunted. He was the kind of guy who still believed in serving and protecting, a concept that felt quaint, even dangerous, to me. My first instinct was to just drive past, let the professionals handle it, but my foot, heavy as lead, pressed the brake. I killed the engine, the sudden silence inside the car even more unsettling than the drone of the road. I watched Luke approach the house, his flashlight beam a confident spear against the encroaching darkness. He knocked, then waited. A flicker of movement on the porch. A woman. I got out, my worn leather jacket feeling a little less like comfort and more like armor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but which made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. My fingers went to my wrist, my thumb rotating the crown of the old wristwatch. The woman stood on her porch, her silhouette trembling against the pale, anemic glow of the porch light. Tear streaks gleamed on her cheeks, catching the faint light as she clutched the railing like a lifeline. Her shoulders shook slightly, and she clutched the edge of the door frame, her nails scraping against the wood as if anchoring herself. Her gaze darted nervously between Luke and the darkness beyond, pupils wide and glistening, betraying the terror she couldn't fully put into words. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, hitching as though she was trying to steady a panic that threatened to consume her. Luke was doing his best calm and authoritative voice, which probably sounded about as reassuring as a death rattle to her. I stepped up beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "Ma'am, we're here to help," Luke said, his voice softer now. "Can you tell us what you saw?" Her voice was a jagged whisper, her lips trembling as though each word cost her a piece of herself. It's not a person, it's something else. In the backyard." Her hands gripped the porch railing so tightly I could see her knuckles turning bone white, as if letting go would allow the terror to pull her under. The porch light flickered, casting erratic shadows across her tear-streaked face, amplifying the fear that radiated from her trembling frame. The vagueness was classic. People always struggled to describe the truly anomalous, their minds rejecting what their eyes had seen. Luke's jaw tightened. He glanced at me, a silent communication passing between us. He wanted to go check, but he didn't want to leave her out here. The air felt thicker, every breath like swallowing a lump of dread. "Stay inside, ma'am," I instructed, my voice surprisingly steady, though every word felt heavy, as if I was trying to convince myself more than her. I caught the tremble in her hands, her fingers curling tightly around the doorframe, reluctant to let go. She hesitated before stepping back into the perceived safety of her home, her wide eyes fixed on the yard like it might lunge at her any second. The click of the lock, hollow and final, echoed in the sudden quiet. I drew a sharp breath to steady my nerves, even as the faint rustling from the shadows gnawed at my resolve. I nodded at Luke. "Let's check it out." My own internal monologue was a litany of sarcastic self-reproach. "Here we go." Vance, drawn to the flames like a moth with a death wish. Just like every other goddamn time. This was the curse, wasn't it? Not just bad luck, but a magnet for the things that crawl in the dark. The backyard was silent, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. The faint creak of branches swaying in an unseen breeze, and the distant hum of insects seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air carried a faint metallic tang, mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil and something else. Something vaguely acrid, like burnt hair or ozone. Our flashlights sliced through the oppressive dark, beams illuminating tufts of overgrown grass and, chillingly, a child's forgotten tricycle lying on its side, one wheel slowly spinning. The domesticity of it, the innocence, made the creeping dread even worse. Then, near the edge of the wooden deck, I spotted it. My stomach churned, a sudden, violent wave of nausea washing over me. A grotesque fragment of something once alive. A dog's leg, severed cleanly just below the knee, fur matted with dark, viscous blood. It lay unnaturally still on the damp grass, the jagged marks at the severed end of the bone not consistent with any animal attack I'd ever seen. These were too precise, too surgical, yet also tearing, inhuman. The air felt heavier, the silence oppressive. I crouched down, the beam of my mag light fixing on the mangled limb. The blood was still wet, gleaming sickly in the artificial light. "What do you make of this, Luke?" My voice was hushed, almost a whisper. Despite the fact that only the chirping of crickets answered, my hand instinctively went to my wristwatch again, my thumb rubbing the cool metal. A grounding mechanism, a small, mechanical certainty in a chaotic, uncertain world. Luke knelt beside me, his own flashlight dancing across the ground, illuminating the disturbed earth around the gruesome find. His face was pale, his eyes wide, the youthful optimism leaching out of them like ink from a blotter. "Nothing good," he muttered, his voice tight, barely audible above the frantic thud of my own heart. "Nothing good at all. Let's keep moving. See if we can find the rest." My guts twisted at the implication. We moved slowly, methodically, our beams cutting through the inky blackness that clung to the property line. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to watch us. The back of my neck prickled. This wasn't just some animal. This was deliberate. "Vance, over here," Luke hissed, his voice sharper, more urgent. I turned to see him crouched near the far side of the deck, his flashlight fixed on a peculiar set of gouges in the wooden support beams. Deep, ragged gashes, torn into the solid wood as if by something immensely powerful. "These ain't dog scratches," he muttered, tracing one with a gloved finger. "Not a bear, either. Too deliberate, too clean on the edges despite the depth." Suddenly, the air shifted. It wasn't a change in temperature, but a palpable pressure, like walking into deep water. A low growl, guttural and wrong, resonated from the tree line that bordered the backyard. My chest tightened, the sound gripping me like an unseen hand squeezing my lungs. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and oppressive, that made the air itself feel charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Luke froze beside me, his eyes wide, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, his youthful bravado momentarily shattered. Both our beams swung toward the sound, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light, rendering our powerful flashlights useless against the sheer blackness of the woods. The growl deepened, vibrating in my bones, rattling my teeth. It was too low, too resonant for any known animal. It spoke of deep-seated hunger, of ancient, predatory malice. Then it moved, a hulking silhouette, a formless mass of shadow, darting faster than any creature of flesh and bone should. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, a mere blur against the deeper darkness, leaving only an echo of unnatural speed and a chilling certainty of something utterly malevolent. "What the hell was that?" Luke demanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed terror. He was no longer the eager deputy. He was just a kid, seeing something his training hadn't prepared him for, not sticking around to find out. "Back to the car. Now," I barked, my own voice hoarse, a desperate attempt to inject some semblance of control into a situation spiraling wildly into the unknown. My instinct, honed by years of running, screamed at me to flee. Now! We sprinted, the growling growing louder, closer, until it felt like the very air around us was vibrating, a physical assault on my eardrums. The metallic tang in the air intensified, stinging my nostrils. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but saw nothing, only the crushing blackness. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins propelled me forward. Every footfall felt like a frantic plea for escape. We reached Luke's cruiser, tearing open the doors and scrambling inside, slamming them shut with a desperate finality. The flimsy metal felt like a last-ditch effort at a shield against an invisible, encroaching horror. Then, a sickening thud against the back window, followed by a scraping sound that sent a shiver of ice down my spine. The glass didn't shatter, but it flexed inwards, groaning under an immense, unseen pressure. We both jumped, adrenaline spiking. Luke spun around, his hand on his holstered weapon, his eyes wide and frantic. But there was nothing there when we looked, only the lingering vibration in the glass. A ghostly echo of impact. The cruiser's engine roared to life with a desperate grind of the starter. Luke slammed it into reverse, peeling out of the driveway, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. We tore down Black Hollow Lane, the rear view mirror reflecting only the indifferent, swallowing darkness of the night. We barely made it a mile down the road when the police radio, a constant, low-level hum of background noise, erupted again, louder this time, sharper. Units, multiple calls reporting disturbances. Same MO, shadows in backyards, abnormal sounds. We need backup at 242 Elm Grove. The dispatcher's voice was strained, the undercurrent of panic now overt. My grip tightened on the wheel, my knuckles white. A cold sweat trickled down my back, plastering my shirt to my skin. Multiple calls. It wasn't just that one house. It wasn't just some local weirdo. This was spreading. And I was in the middle of it. Of course I am. Luke, surprisingly, didn't hesitate. He was still pale, but the initial shock was replaced by a grim determination. The siren wailed to life, a mournful cry slicing through the night. Elm Grove, he stated, his jaw set. We raced through winding, deserted streets to the new location. The adrenaline hammering in my veins was no longer a cold surge, but a burning, electric current, making my muscles twitch. My wristwatch, a useless comfort, felt heavy on my wrist. I knew what we were going to find. I always knew. When we arrived, the house at 242 Elm Grove was eerily quiet. Too quiet. A stillness that spoke not of peace, but of vacancy, of something having already swept through and claimed its prey. The front door was ajar, a gaping maw of blackness against the pale siding. Splintered wood suggested it hadn't opened willingly. It had been forced, violently. "Stay here, Vance," Luke commanded, his voice low, his hand on his sidearm. "Call for more backup, and stay out of sight." He was a cop. After all, it was his job. Mine was to run, but my feet felt rooted to the pavement. The reluctant conscience, that persistent, irritating itch, flared. Not this time. Vance, not yet. I watched him. My breath hitched. He drew his weapon, nudged the door open further with his foot, and slipped inside. The blackness swallowed him instantly. Inside, the living room was chaos. Furniture overturned, lamps shattered, the cheap floral wallpaper smeared with something dark, something viscous and smelling unmistakably of iron. My guts lurched, and then the scream. A man's voice, raw and primal, a sound torn from the deepest part of the soul, tore through the stillness from upstairs. It wasn't just fear, it was pure, unadulterated agony, and it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I didn't think, I just moved. My feet carried me over the threshold, across the wrecked living room, up the staircase. Every creak of the old wood under my weight was amplified. Every thud of my own heart a hammer against my ribs. The smell of iron, thick and cloying, grew stronger with every step, filling my nostrils, coating my tongue. It was the smell of spilled life. In the bedroom, we found him, a man, older, probably in his late 50s, bloodied, trembling uncontrollably, huddled in a corner like a cornered animal. His eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at something unseen. His arm, shaking violently, pointed to the shattered window, shards of glass glinting like malevolent teeth on the floor. It took her. It wasn't human. God, it wasn't human. His voice was a ragged croak, already hoarse from screaming. Before we could respond, before Luke could even try to offer some semblance of reassurance, a deafening crash came from downstairs, followed by the shattering of glass and a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The thing was still here. It was downstairs. Luke's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and grim determination. He motioned for me to stay with the man, a silent order to protect the survivor while he confronted the monster. Stay with him. Vance, don't move. He didn't wait for my acknowledgement. He pivoted, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he disappeared around the corner and down the stairs, swallowed once more by the hungry darkness. The silence that followed was even worse than the screams. It stretched, taut and suffocating, punctuated only by the shuddering gasps of the man in the corner and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Every second felt like an hour. I gripped my mag light tighter, its weight a meager comfort. My thumb traced the cold metal of my wristwatch again, over and over, as if the repetitive motion could somehow rewind time, reverse the last few horrific minutes. Luke? I called after a minute, my voice a barely audible tremor, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Luke? No response, just the whimpering of the man, the distant, impossible growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and the chilling, suffocating silence of the house. The world had indeed ripped open, and I was left standing on the edge of the void, utterly, irrevocably alone, staring into the darkness that had consumed everything else. By dawn, the woods around Elm Grove were swarming with search teams, flashing lights of police cruisers and ambulances painting the trees in an eerie, pulsing kaleidoscope. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, blood, and the metallic tang of fear. I sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a thin, scratchy blanket draped over my shoulders. Luke leaned against his cruiser, his face pale, drawn, and etched with the kind of haunted exhaustion that spoke of having seen too much. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. We both knew whatever we encountered that night wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The woman from Black Hollow Lane had been found, unharmed physically, but her mind was broken, a vacant stare in her eyes. The wife from Elm Grove was still missing. The husband had been taken to the hospital, incoherent. I'll never forget the last call that came over the police radio as we left the scene, the static-laced words cutting through the early morning calm, addressed directly to me. Officer Vance, report of another sighting near your residence. Please advise. My blood ran cold. My residence, the cheap motel I was staying at, chosen for its anonymity. The chill that ran down my spine wasn't from the morning air. It felt like the lingering grip of something unseen, a reminder of the oppressive presence that seemed to haunt the shadows of that long, harrowing night. It echoed the oppressive stillness of that backyard, where the metallic tang of fear had clung to the night, where I'd first seen the mutilated leg. Every detail of the night resurfaced, vivid and raw, as if warning me that this was just the beginning. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Even now, every shadow feels like it's watching, waiting, and then, just when I think I've escaped it, just when the sun has finally climbed high enough to chase away the last vestiges of the night. My phone rings. Earlier, the faint static and occasional interference on the radio had felt like background noise, but now it seemed like a harbinger of this moment, a low, buzzing hum in the universe. The screen reads, "Unknown caller." My breath hitches, catching in my throat. As I pick it up, my thumb instinctively rubbing the cool metal of my wristwatch. The faint static whispers through the speaker, a prelude to the horror. The voice on the other end is low, distorted, and unmistakable, a chilling echo of the growl from the darkness. It's not over. This was it. This was why I ran. This was why I would keep running, because it always found me. Character count 9987. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was in my bones, a tendril of ice reaching from the flickering screen, burrowing into my skull. My breath hitched, caught in my throat, as the eyeless face on the monitor turned, not towards the camera, but towards me. A silent, ancient whisper echoing in the hollow space behind my eyes. "Why do you look away?" My hand shot out, a primal jolt of terror overriding every instinct, slamming the laptop shut with a violent snap. But the image, the feeling, was already burned into my retinas, a brand on my soul. The metallic tang of fear coated my tongue, thick and putrid. Outside the cramped, frigid utility room, the distant, muffled roar of a jet engine vibrated through the concrete, a mundane sound that suddenly felt like the howl of a beast. I could still feel those unseen eyes, a pressure behind my own, as if they'd reached through the digital veil and pressed their impossible gaze against my very consciousness. It began, as these things always do, with a seemingly innocuous job, a temporary gig, late nights, just enough cash to keep the wheels turning, and my past buried. I was trying to outrun one nightmare, only to stumble headlong into another, hidden beneath the polished floors of what the world knew as a bustling international airport. Another gig, another city, another slice of my life gone to the grind. That's how it usually starts. This time, it was Las Vegas. Not the neon-drenched strip, but the gritty underbelly of McCarran International, where the glamour wore thin and the only light was the harsh glare of fluorescent tubes. I'd picked up a contract, a temporary logistics driver for an airport support company, moving supplies, equipment, anything that needed to get from one hangar to another, or from a loading dock to a restricted maintenance area. Mostly night shifts, Vance, the dispatcher had mumbled, not bothering to make eye contact. Less traffic, easier to move the heavy stuff. Sounded like paradise. Less traffic, less people, less chance of someone recognizing the weary lines etched around my eyes. Less chance of me having to explain why I was a man living out of a go bag, always looking over my shoulder. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual that first night, a familiar comfort and a constant reminder of how long I'd been running. The air inside the sprawling airport at 2 a.m. was recycled and stale, carrying faint hints of jet fuel and too many hurried goodbyes. The place was a mausoleum of human transit, hollowed out and echoing after the last flights had departed. I preferred it that way. Ghosts are quieter when there's no one around to scream. I'd done my usual scan, a habit born of too many close calls. Not a heroic sweep, just the twitch of a man who knows that danger doesn't always announce itself with a trumpet blast. Sometimes it's a flicker in peripheral vision, a shadow that clings too long, a silence that's just a little too deep. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick more than a time teller, felt cool against my thumb as I absently turned the crown. The job itself was mind-numbingly boring, which was exactly what I wanted. Drive a forklift, load crates, drop them off, repeat. The hum of the electric engine, the clatter of pallets, a monotonous symphony. But even in the mundane, the wrongness began to seep in, like dampness through old concrete. It started with the other drivers, or rather, the lack of them. My shift often overlapped with a skeleton crew, men who looked like they'd seen a lot of sand and sun, with eyes that were too sharp, too wary for mere forklift operators. They moved with a military precision that felt out of place in a civilian cargo bay, their backs too straight, their whispers too low. Plainclothes soldier, the original narrator had called them. I knew the type. Not the kind that followed orders from a general, but the kind who looked like they were guarding something far older, far nastier than conventional ordnance. They reminded me of the men I'd seen around that compound outside Wichita. The one with the empty or pristine house and the woman with the skin rug. Always the same look in their eyes, too knowing, too guarded, like they were hiding secrets that would make your skin crawl. Then there were the doors, hidden, unmarked metal doors, tucked away in obscure corners of the vast hangars, or behind mountains of crated equipment. They didn't have authorized personnel only signs. They had nothing, just blank, unyielding metal, often sealed with heavy-duty locks and occasionally guarded by one of those silent, hawk-eyed drivers who just happened to be loitering nearby. My internal monologue, the cynical, sarcastic voice that usually narrated my miseries, started asking questions. What's behind door number 3, Leo? Probably just another break room filled with stale coffee and bad decisions. Or maybe, just maybe, the answers to all your problems? Or the end of them? I knew the answer. It was always the end. I'd learned that the hard way, thinking I could trust a friendly face, only to find myself in a situation worse than I could have imagined, like when I'd let Mitch into my home, not knowing what really lurked inside those walls. One night, the dispatch told me to take a load down to sub-level Bravo. My stomach tightened, a familiar premonition, a cold coil of dread that had become my constant companion since that night on the mountain pass, with the hitchhiker and the endless snow. Sub-level Bravo? I asked, my voice flat. Never heard of it. The dispatcher, a rail-thin man with a perpetually tired face, didn't look up from his monitor. New section, classified. Just take the forklift to the freight elevator at Hangar 7. They'll meet you there. Classified? That word always meant trouble. Usually it meant something was about to tear a hole in my already shredded peace of mind. But I was in too deep. Bills piling up. Buster needing his premium kibble. Reluctant conscience. You persistent bastard. My fatal flaw. Hangar 7 was a cavernous space, smelling of oil and cold steel. The freight elevator was massive, big enough to swallow my forklift whole. 2 of the plainclothes soldiers were waiting, silent, their faces impassive. One nodded curtly, gesturing to the elevator. I drove in, the metal grating beneath the tires protesting with a low groan. The doors slid shut, sealing us in. There were no buttons inside, only a small keycard reader. One of the soldiers swiped his card. The elevator lurched, then began its slow, deliberate descent. It wasn't just a floor down, it was deep. I felt the pressure build in my ears, the air growing colder, heavier. The hum of the elevator motor seemed to shift, becoming a lower, more resonant thrum, as if it were connected to something vast and powerful beneath us. We descended for what felt like an eternity, far longer than any standard basement level. The fluorescent light within the elevator flickered, casting eerie, shifting shadows that made the soldiers' faces look skeletal. I gripped the forklift's steering wheel, my knuckles white, my gaze fixed on the digital display above the door, watching the numbers tick down into negative double digits. This wasn't just a sub-level. This was something else entirely. This was the nexus. When the doors finally parted, the air that rushed in hit me like a physical blow, a biting chill mixed with that persistent, unsettling metallic tang I'd noticed on the surface. It was the smell of static, of ozone, of something wrong. The space we entered was immense, a network of tunnels carved into the earth, stretching further than my maglite beam could reach. The walls were a mix of rough-hewn rock and poured concrete, slick with condensation, gleaming under the dim, flickering amber lights. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of polished industrial flooring and raw, unfinished stone. The hum was omnipresent here, vibrating through the soles of my boots, a deep, resonant thrum that spoke of immense hidden machinery. It felt alive, this place like a dormant beast breathing. McCarran's shadowed underbelly isn't just an abstract thought, it's an engineered reality, the narrator had said. He wasn't wrong. I unloaded my crates onto a waiting pallet, my movements stiff, eyes darting. This was Hive 1. I gleaned from stray labels and whispered words. Administration, logistics, the mundane facade for the monstrous. But even here, there was a tension that stretched the air thin, a sense of being under scrutiny, even when no one was looking. There were more people down here than I expected, moving with quiet purpose, their faces grim, their eyes betraying a knowledge that no ordinary human should possess. They were like the lost souls from that strange farm I'd seen in my NDE, moving without hope, without true life in their eyes. My job was supposedly done, but the soldiers, those silent, watchful guardians, had other ideas. You're needed for an emergency transfer. Vance, Hive 4. My blood ran cold. Hive 4. The whispers I'd overheard from other drivers. The frantic, hushed tones. The quicker, terrified glances. Hive 4 was where nightmares are born. Hive 4 was where they kept things that bent reality. My mind flashed to the stories of the man in the walls, of the entity wearing Mitch's face. What kind of horrors were so contained, yet so powerful, that they needed their own designated hive? The journey to Hive 4 was a descent into an ever deeper labyrinth. The corridors narrowed, the air grew colder, and the hum intensified, vibrating through my chest until it felt like my very bones were rattling. The lighting became sparser, creating long, deep shadows that danced with every flicker. There were no friendly faces here, only more silent guards, their weapons held a little tighter, their eyes scanning the dark with an intensity that screamed of constant, imminent danger. I could feel the presence of something heavy, ancient, and utterly alien, pressing in on me from behind the reinforced concrete and steel. It was the same crushing weight I'd felt near that abandoned house where the pig creature had hunted me, but multiplied 100-fold. This wasn't just a place, it was a cage for something beyond human comprehension. We stopped at a reinforced triple-locked door, unlike any other I'd seen, a keypad, a retinal scanner, and then a heavy, clanking mechanism that reminded me of a submarine hatch. "Wait here," one of the guards growled, his voice a low rumble. He vanished inside. I was alone in the dimly lit corridor, the omnipresent hum now a low throb in my skull. My hand went to my wristwatch, turning the crown aimlessly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My go bag felt a million miles away. This was it, wasn't it? This was where Leo Vance, cynical, world-weary survivor, finally ran out of road. My thoughts drifted to Buster, alone in that cheap motel room, wondering where I was. He deserved better than this. He deserved better than me. The door hissed open, and the guard reappeared, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "They need an override in the surveillance room. Tech's offline." He shoved a tablet into my hands. "Go, and don't touch anything else." My eyes widened. A surveillance room in Hive 4? Every fiber of my being screamed at me to refuse, to drop the tablet and run. But the guard's eyes were fixed on me, a desperate plea mixed with a threat. And that cursed, inconvenient conscience of mine. It kicked in, always does, always ruins everything. The surveillance room was small, freezing, and littered with discarded coffee cups. A bank of flickering monitors lined one wall, displaying grainy, distorted feeds of different sections of Hive 4. The air here was even thicker, charged with a palpable tension, like the silence before a lightning strike. The metallic tang was sharper, tinged with something else now, something acrid, like burnt hair and ozone. It was the smell of unnatural power, of things that shouldn't be. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the tablet. I found the override sequence, punched it in, and waited. As the systems came back online, the monitors flickered, then resolved into sharper images. My eyes were drawn to one in particular, labeled Cell Alpha. The camera angle was low, distorting the perspective, but the sight was clear enough to freeze my blood, solidify it into something crystalline and brittle in my veins. Two figures, not human. "Do not speak of the twins," a colleague once warned the original narrator. I understood now. Towering, pale as moonlight, their skin a waxy, translucent white that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Black, vine-like growths cascaded from their heads, writhing with a subtle, unnerving life of their own. They didn't walk, they drifted. Their movements were impossibly fluid, slow, deliberate. Yet they seemed to cover immense distances with no discernible effort, as if the laws of physics simply rearranged themselves around them. The terror wasn't just in their appearance, it was in their presence. The air around them shimmered, recoiling, as if reality itself was afraid. I saw a fleeting, grainy image of something on the floor near them, a discarded uniform, maybe, or something that used to be a person. And then, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of my being, buzzing in my teeth, vibrating behind my eyeballs. It was their communication, a psychic imprint, not a spoken word. My gaze was locked on the screen, a morbid fascination warring with a desperate urge to look away. One of the twins, the one closer to the camera, shifted, slowly, its eyeless face, smooth and featureless as polished ivory, turned, not towards the lens, not towards the blank, unseeing optics. It turned towards me, directly towards me. I felt it. The impossible connection, a tendril of absolute cold consciousness reaching from the flickering pixels, burrowing into my skull, probing the raw, exposed nerves of my fear. It was an ancient, predatory intelligence, one that understood the very core of my being, the fragile, terrified thing I tried so hard to hide beneath layers of cynicism and self-deprecation. My breath hitched. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. A whisper, soft and lilting, echoed not in my ears but in the hollow space behind my eyes. "Why do you look away?" It wasn't a question. It was a command, a challenge. My hand, acting on instinct, slammed the laptop shut with a violent snap, the sound deafening in the sudden, echoing silence. The screen went black, but the image, the feeling, was already burned into my retinas, a brand on my soul. I stumbled back, hitting the metal console behind me, a jolt of pain barely registering through the icy grip of terror. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, threatening to burst through my chest. The metallic tang in the air was now overpowering, and I could taste it, acrid and nauseating, in the back of my throat. I stood there for an eternity, or perhaps only a few seconds, trembling, my eyes wide, staring at the blank screen, half expecting the eyeless face to reappear, to peer out at me from the darkness. My mind reeled. These weren't prisoners, they were keepers. The cruelest irony, our jailers. The thought was so vast, so horrifying, it threatened to fracture my already fragile sanity. This wasn't just a monster. This was something that broke the rules of reality, that saw through the world and saw me. It was the same soul-deep dread that had permeated my very being after that NDE. The realization that the universe wasn't just indifferent, it was actively hostile. A farm run by entities who viewed us as nothing more than livestock. The guard returned, his face a mask of impatience. "Done," he snapped. My voice was a croak. Yeah, done. He didn't notice the tremor in my hand as I returned the tablet, or the way my eyes kept darting to the closed laptop, convinced that the twins' impossible gaze was still focused on me from within its dormant shell. He didn't notice the cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back, or the faint, ozone-like scent that now clung to my jacket. He just grunted and gestured for me to follow. The journey back up, through the labyrinthine corridors, felt like an escape from a nightmare that was still happening. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a towering, eyeless entity. Every distant hum of machinery sounded like the psychic whisper of the twins. The thought that these things, these IDAs, were under WEREN, hidden in plain sight beneath one of the busiest airports in the world, was a reality too terrifying to hold. The conspiracy theories about Area 51 meant to distract suddenly made chilling sense. They were a smokescreen, a stage for a grand illusion, while the real horrors nested quietly under our feet. I finished my shift, working on autopilot, my body a puppet, my mind trapped in a loop of icy dread. I didn't say a word to anyone. The other drivers, the soldiers, they all looked normal, but now I saw them through a different lens. They were part of the mechanism, either complicit or oblivious, or simply too terrified to acknowledge the truth. They were just like the ordinary people I'd encountered on the road. People who looked normal but were hiding something monstrous beneath the surface, like Ethan, the charming cannibal. The world was a thin veil, and I seemed to be cursed to constantly tear it open. As I drove out of the airport compound, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in sickly shades of orange and purple, I glanced at WEREN International in my rearview mirror, a bustling hub of human activity, planes taking off and landing, lights blazing, a facade. Beneath it, the nexus, the hives, the unseen radiation, and the ancient, monstrous twins. The roar of the jets, the hum beneath the runway. They weren't just the sounds of commerce. They were the whispers of the unseen, the cries of a hidden world functioning parallel to our own. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, the worn leather of my jacket digging into my shoulders. This was a whole new layer of trauma, a fresh brand on my already scarred psyche. My past kept finding me, kept adding new horrors to the collection: the fire, the hitchhiker, Ethan, Olivia, Mitch, the pig creature, the farm in the afterlife, and now, the things that wore the guise of airport infrastructure. I was marked, forever drawn to the abyss. And the worst part, despite the terror, despite the constant gnawing fear, a tiny, hateful part of me knew I would keep looking. I would keep seeing, because that's who I was, the haunted everyman, the weary wanderer. My curse wasn't just that these things happened to me. It was that I couldn't look away. Not really, or not when the eyeless face demanded, "Why do you look away?" I had no answer for it. I never did. My only answer was to keep driving, to keep running, to keep trying to outrun the echoes of a truth too terrible to bear. For now, the wheels were still turning, and Buster was waiting. The scream wasn't human. It was a sound ripped from the throat of something that knew ultimate despair, a wet, guttural shriek that echoed off the polished white walls of the Genesis Institute, turning the air thick and sour. My hands, calloused from 100 too many late-night drives and 1,000 too many cheap hotel beds, were slick with something warm and sticky. My old analog wristwatch, the face cracked, but the hands still stubbornly ticking, pressed cold against my clammy wrist. I didn't dare look at the time, or at what had made the sound. My gaze was fixed on the shifting shape beneath the pristine white sheet, a ripple of impossible anatomy that defied every law of nature I'd ever grudgingly acknowledged. My breath hitched, tasting of salt and fear, and a voice, not my own, but a memory, whispered in the back of my mind. "You should have run, Vance. You always should have run." Funny how life throws you these little curveballs, isn't it? One minute you're stacking boxes in a dimly lit warehouse. The next you're watching the sun bake a private island. And then, just like that, you're standing in a sterile nightmare, covered in somebody else's terror. It all started, as these things often do, with an email and a job that seemed too good to be true. I remember the sting of the salt spray on my face as the small plane banking over water so impossibly blue it looked painted. Below, the island shimmered, a postcard paradise plucked straight from some glossy travel brochure. White buildings gleamed like fresh porcelain teeth against the lush green, fringed by impossibly tall palm trees that swayed in a breeze I couldn't yet feel. The New Genesis Institute. Even the name tasted like propaganda, like something designed to trick you into believing in a future you knew damn well wasn't coming. My gut, a loyal companion through a lifetime of bad decisions, had already started to knot itself, a cold, familiar dread coiling like a serpent beneath my ribs. Too perfect, always too perfect. It reminded me, vaguely, of the way the Sycamore Grove house had looked before the fire, an innocent facade hiding a rot that went bone deep. That memory was a low hum beneath everything else, a constant warning. I was here as a temporary handyman, a hired hand to fix a malfunctioning water purification system that, according to the contract, required specialized expertise, which in my world usually meant we don't want anyone local asking questions. The pay was good, obscenely good for a week's work, enough to keep the tank full and the rent paid for another month or two. Another step on the endless road. I'd pack my go bag, the one with the emergency cash and the heavy mag light, just in case. It was always just in case with me. My worn leather jacket, a second skin, was draped over the seat next to me, offering what little comfort it could. Stepping off the plane onto the pristine airstrip, the heat hit me like a physical blow, thick and humid, smelling of ozone and something faintly floral, almost sickly sweet. Uniformed staff, all with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, greeted us, myself and a couple of other new arrivals, a pale, nervous-looking woman named Claire, and Mariah, who seemed to carry a perpetual cloud of worry around her. They were here for the program, the specialized fertility treatments I'd gleaned from snippets of the non-disclosure agreement I'd barely skimmed before signing. I wasn't a medical man, didn't care for clinics, but the money had talked. It always did. Lark, an unnervingly cheerful staff member with eyes like polished emeralds, took us under her wing. She moved with a practiced grace, her smile unwavering, her voice a calm, modulated purr that grated on my nerves almost immediately. Too serene, too controlled. "Welcome to the New Genesis Institute," she chimed, her arm gesturing across the manicured grounds. "You'll each have your own cottage." She pointed to a cluster of small, identical white structures nestled among vibrant, exotic flora. "Feel free to explore the grounds, but do take care. The northern cliffs are quite treacherous." She nodded towards a low, concrete wall winding through the verdant landscape, almost swallowed by overgrown vines. "It's to ensure everyone's safety. We wouldn't want anyone straying." My eyes lingered on that wall. A low wall, easily climbable, yet it pulsed with a peculiar energy, an unspoken warning that was far more imposing than its physical height. Walls always spoke volumes. The ones that confined you, the ones that protected you, the ones that hid things. I'd seen too many of them. Then Dr. Evelyn Hart emerged from the main building. She was everything I'd expected and nothing I hadn't. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a bearing that spoke of unassailable confidence. Her eyes, a startling green, swept over us, taking in every detail with an almost clinical precision. They weren't unkind, but they were devoid of warmth, like a surgeon's gaze before an incision. "Welcome," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying an undercurrent of steel. "You've made the right choice coming here. I promise. We'll take excellent care of you." She sounded less like a doctor and more like a CEO, or perhaps a particularly persuasive cult leader. It was the kind of promise that always came with a hidden price tag, the kind I knew by heart. My thumb worried the crown of my wristwatch, a familiar, unconscious habit. Tick-tock. Vance. Time to pay attention. I was led to my cottage, small and immaculate, with a strange, faint smell of ozone and something metallic beneath a lingering scent of disinfectant. My tools were already waiting. The water purification unit was indeed on the fritz, humming with a sickly whine. I opened my tool case, the familiar weight of the wrenches and meters, a momentary comfort. This was my world. Predictable machines, predictable breakdowns, not whatever this was. Over the next few days, I worked on the purification system, a tedious job that gave me ample opportunity to observe. The place was a bizarre blend of luxury resort and medical facility. The food was gourmet, served in an airy dining hall with ocean views. The staff were relentlessly polite, always smiling, always deferring. But there was a hollowness to their cheer, a lack of genuine spark, like puppets on a string. The women, about 20 of them initially, spent their days in what Lark called group therapy sessions. I saw them gathered on the lawns, walking along the beach, their faces a mixture of hope and a profound, bone-deep weariness. They were all single, Lark had mentioned, all with a history of loss, all desperate for a child. A perfect demographic, I thought, for a place that promised miracles. Desperation always made good bait. I'd seen it before. People so hungry for something they'd ignore the hooks in the bread. I'd catch snippets of conversations, stories of grief and struggle that made my own past feel like a dull ache in comparison. Still, it resonated. I knew what it was to be haunted by loss, to carry the weight of a life that had gone irretrievably wrong. It was a burden I knew intimately. The way they spoke, the raw longing in their eyes. It was almost enough to make me feel something other than my usual detached cynicism. Almost. But then I'd catch a glimpse of one of the staff members, their unnerving smile fixed, and the feeling would pass, replaced by a cold knot in my stomach. Mariah, one of the women who'd arrived with me, started to unravel first. I'd see her pacing alone on the beach late at night, her arms wrapped around herself, head constantly swiveling. Her eyes, when I caught them, were wide with a fear that seemed too real for this manufactured paradise. She was jumpy, barely eating. I heard her whispering once to Claire, her voice low and frantic, about being watched. She thought there were cameras everywhere, listening devices. Claire tried to calm her, patting her arm, but I saw the doubt flicker in Claire's own eyes. I didn't see any cameras myself, not obvious ones. But then again, the obvious ones were for amateurs. This place didn't strike me as amateur. Just paranoia, I muttered to myself, adjusting a wrench. But my mind kept replaying Mariah's darting gaze, the genuine terror on her face. She reminded me of someone cornered, and I knew that look. I'd seen it in my own reflection too many times. That old analog watch felt heavy on my wrist. I checked the time. Not that it mattered. Then, 6 of them were gone, including Mariah. Just like that. One morning, the numbers in the dining hall were noticeably smaller. The air felt colder, despite the tropical heat. Claire looked pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Dr. Hart addressed the remaining 14 women with the same practiced calm. A few women were assessed as incompatible for the program, she announced, her voice unwavering. They have been returned home. Returned home. The phrase hung in the air, a perfectly bland lie. No goodbyes, no farewells, just gone. My cynical brain immediately supplied a few alternate scenarios for returned home. A shallow grave on the north side of the island, a dark room, a genetic sample taken, and the rest discarded. Incompatible. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. What made someone incompatible for a fertility treatment? Their personality? Their potential for asking too many questions? The hair on the back of my neck prickled. This wasn't a clinic. It was a factory, and the raw material was human desperation. I found myself sketching more in the evenings, hunched over a crumpled napkin in my cottage. Not monsters, not yet. Just the layout of the main building, the strange symmetry of the cottages, the ominous line of the border wall, the unnervingly blank faces of the staff, trying to find the pattern, the fault line and the perfection. My hand twitched, adding a small, dark question mark next to the wall. The remaining women, their numbers thinned, seemed to double down on their hope, as if Mariah's disappearance was a warning to be more compliant, more eager. Dr. Hart explained their innovative science, a blend of IVF and advanced genetic optimization techniques. She talked about healthier, stronger generations, about optimal health. It was all very scientific, very detached, a cold, clinical promise of perfection. Every single one of them became pregnant, quickly, unnervingly so. The island, which had seemed merely unnerving, began to feel like a pressure cooker. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a different kind of anticipation. The women, their bellies swelling, would walk with a new, almost beatific glow, touching their stomachs with a reverence that was both beautiful and profoundly disturbing. They were getting what they wanted, but at what cost? I continued my work, the humming of the purification system a dull counterpoint to the growing unease in my own head. I started taking longer routes around the facility, casually observing, listening. The staff seemed to move with more purpose, their smiles a little tighter. The border wall looked less like a safeguard against cliffs and more like a barrier against escape. One night, I saw Claire on the beach, her heavily pregnant belly casting a grotesque shadow in the moonlight. She was sitting by the water, her shoulders hunched. I hesitated, my usual instinct to keep my distance battling against that damn, inconvenient spark of conscience, the one that always dragged me into trouble. She looked utterly miserable, a stark contrast to the blissful contentment of the other expectant mothers. "Rough night?" I asked, my voice raspy from disuse. I kicked a small stone with the toe of my boot. She startled, then turned, her eyes wide and shadowed. "Oh, it's you, Leo." She rarely remembered my name. "Yeah, he's active." She patted her belly, a grimace distorting her features. Her baby kicked, a visible ripple beneath her clothes, strong enough to make her wince. "Good, healthy, right?" I tried to sound reassuring, but the words felt like ash. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "No, not just healthy, something off. He kicks so hard, Leo, like he's trying to get out. It's not just a baby moving, it's violent." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Do you ever feel like there's something wrong here with all of this?" My blood ran cold. The directness of her question, the raw fear in her eyes, stripped away my practiced detachment. I thought of Mariah, her face etched with terror before she vanished. I thought of Dr. Hart's calculating eyes, her words about optimal health and genetic optimization. I thought of the Sycamore Grove house, the way it had hidden its secrets behind pristine walls until they burst into fire. "Yeah," I said, the single word a quiet admission. "I do." Claire's eyes, wide with a desperate relief, met mine. "I'm scared, Leo, about the baby, about what they've done to him, to us." She touched her belly again, almost protectively. "It's not just a feeling. I saw something last night in the medical wing." She hesitated, glancing around as if the very air was listening. A baby, already born, but it wasn't right." Her voice broke. "What wasn't right?" I pressed, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands instinctively went to my watch. "Its eyes," she whispered, tears tracking paths down her pale cheeks. They were too old, and it moved like something that shouldn't. And the nurse, she was crying, real tears, not like the others. A baby with old eyes, a crying nurse. This wasn't some minor medical anomaly. This was the dark underbelly of optimal health. My mind raced. The missing women, the promises, the absolute control. My feet, that deep-seated sense of responsibility that always landed me in hot water, were already moving. I had to see, I had to know. For Claire, for Mariah, for the memories that clawed at the edges of my own fragmented past. "Where?" I asked, my voice low and urgent. Claire hesitated, then pointed a trembling finger towards the sprawling main building, specifically the section furthest from our cottages, the one with the minimal lighting after dark. The medical wing. I told Claire to stay put, to act normal, to try and get some rest. My cynical self knew it was a useless instruction, but my conscience, that damn persistent flaw, demanded I offer something. I walked back towards my cottage, grabbed the mag light from my go bag, its heavy, cold weight a familiar comfort. I also grabbed the small sketch pad I'd started carrying, a habit developed after too many encounters with things I couldn't just forget. Maybe, if I saw it, I could sketch it, pin it down, make it real enough to fight. The night air was heavy, humid, buzzing with unseen insects. The path to the medical wing was well lit, designed for visibility, but I knew how to move in shadows. I'd spent too long learning. The main building was mostly dark, but a faint, blue light emanated from a window in the medical wing. I crept closer, pressing myself against the rough, cool stucco wall, inching my way along. The silence of the island was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves and the frantic thump of my own heart. The window was high, but I found a maintenance ladder tucked away behind some shrubs, obviously used for external cleaning. I hauled it over, the metal clanging softly against the concrete, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. I froze, listening, but no one came. They were either very trusting or very confident. I leaned the ladder against the wall, took a deep breath, and began to climb. Through the window, the blue light bathed a pristine, sterile room. Incubators lined one wall, each glowing with a soft, unnatural luminescence. And then I saw them. Not babies, not really. They were infants. Yes, tiny and curled, but something was terribly, profoundly wrong. Their skin was too smooth, almost translucent, stretched taut over frames that seemed too long, too delicate. Their heads were slightly too large. Their eyes, and when one of them stirred, were wide and black, like chips of obsidian. But it wasn't just the color. It was the focus, the unnerving intelligence in them, a gaze that seemed to pierce through the glass of the incubator, through the window, through me. They weren't newborn eyes. They were ancient, and they held a cold, predatory hunger. A staff member, the nurse Claire had mentioned, sat slumped in a chair by one of the incubators, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She wasn't looking at the infants. She was recoiling, as if from a physical blow. She looked less like a caregiver and more like a prisoner. My gaze snapped back to the nearest incubator. One of the infants, no older than a few days, began to stir. Its small, perfectly formed hand, almost too long for its arm, reached out, its tiny fingers flexing, and then, from somewhere deep inside the incubator, came a sound. Not a cry, not a gurgle. It was a low, resonant hum, like a distant, distorted chord struck on some alien instrument. A sound that vibrated not in my ears, but in my very bones. My blood ran cold, colder than any snow-choked mountain pass, colder than the whisper of any dead man. This wasn't human. This was something else entirely, something engineered, something born wrong. Dr. Hart's genetic optimization wasn't about preventing disease. It was about creating a new kind of being, a new kind of terror. And these desperate women, they were just the incubators, the unwitting vessels for something monstrous. The scream I'd heard earlier, the one that had been ripped from an unknown throat, echoed in my mind again, clearer now. It had been the scream of a mother who had seen what her child truly was. My hand tightened on the maglite, knuckles white. The old watch on my wrist seemed to tick louder, counting down seconds to a future I desperately wanted to outrun. But where was there to run? This island was a gilded cage, and the monsters weren't just outside the walls. They were growing inside them. They were already here. The total character count for this revised story is 9,878 characters.